Welcome to Weird Tales After Dark. Here the old stories wake again. These are tales from the shadowed shelves of forgotten libraries. Some will lead you into gothic terror, some into strange dreams, some into the quiet, creeping dread of things better left unknown. So dim the lights, settle in, and listen closely. For the next 3 hours, the door is open, and the tales are about to begin. If you enjoy the following stories, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment to let me know what you think. Now let's get into the first story. The Gateway of the Monster by William Hope Hodgson. In response to Carnacki's usual card of invitation to have dinner and listen to a story, I arrived promptly at 427 Chain Walk to find the 3 others who are always invited to these happy little times there before me. 5 minutes later, Carnacki, Arkwright, Jessup, Taylor, and I were all engaged in the pleasant occupation of dining. "You've not been long away this time," I remarked as I finished my soup, forgetting momentarily Carnacki's dislike of being asked even to skirt the borders of his story, until such time as he was ready. Then he would not stint words. "That's all," he replied with brevity, and I changed the subject, remarking that I had been buying a new gun, to which piece of news he gave an intelligent nod, and a smile which I think showed a genuinely good-humored appreciation of my intentional changing of the conversation. Later, when dinner was finished, Carnacki snugged himself comfortably down in his big chair, along with his pipe, and began his story, with very little circumlocution. "As Hodgson was remarking just now, I've only been away a short time, and for a very good reason, too. I've only been away a short distance. The exact locality, I am afraid, I must not tell you, but it is less than 20 miles from here. Though except for changing a name, that won't spoil the story. And it is a story, too. One of the most extraordinary things ever I have run against. I received a letter a fortnight ago from a man I must call Anderson, asking for an appointment. I arranged a time, and when he came, I found that he wished me to investigate and see whether I could not clear up a long-standing, and too well, authenticated case of what he termed haunting. He gave me the very full particulars, and finally, as the case seemed to present something unique, I decided to take it up. 2 days later, I drove to the house late in the afternoon. I found it a very old place, standing quite alone in its own grounds. Anderson had left a letter with the butler I found, pleading excuses for his absence, and leaving the whole house at my disposal for my investigations. The butler evidently knew the object of my visit, and I questioned him pretty thoroughly during dinner, which I had in a rather lonely state. He is an old and privileged servant, and had the history of the Grey Room exact in detail. From him I learned more particulars regarding 2 things that Anderson had mentioned in but a casual manner. The first was that the door of the Grey Room would be heard in the dead of night to open and slam heavily, and this even though the butler knew it was locked, and the key on the bunch in his pantry. The second was that the bedclothes would always be found torn off the bed and hurled in a heap into a corner. But it was the door slamming that chiefly bothered the old butler. Many and many a time, he told me, had he lain awake and just got shivering with fright, listening, for sometimes the door would be slammed, time after time, thud, 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 so that sleep was impossible. From Anderson I knew already that the room had a history extending back over 150 years. 3 people had been strangled in it, an ancestor of his and his wife and child. This is authentic, as I had taken very great pains to discover, so that you can imagine it was with the feeling I had a striking case to investigate that I went upstairs after dinner to have a look at the Grey Room. Peter, the old butler, was in rather a state about my going, and assured me with much solemnity that in all the 20 years of his service, no one had ever entered that room after nightfall. He begged me, in quite a fatherly way, to wait till the morning, when there would be no danger, and then he could accompany me himself. Of course, I smiled a little at him, and told him not to bother. I explained that I should do no more than look around a bit, and perhaps affix a few seals. He need not fear. I was used to that sort of thing. But he shook his head when I said that. "There isn't many ghosts like ours, sir," he assured me, with mournful pride. And by Jove, he was right, as you will see. I took a couple of candles, and Peter followed me with his bunch of keys. He unlocked the door, but he would not come inside with me. He was evidently in a fright, and he renewed his request that I would put off my examination until daylight. Of course, I laughed at him again, and told him he could stand sentry at the door, and catch anything that came out. "It never comes outside, sir," he said in his funny old solemn manner. Somehow, he managed to make me feel as if I were going to have the creeps right away. Anyway, it was one to him, you know. I left him there and examined the room. It is a big apartment, and well furnished in the grand style with a huge 4-poster, which stands with its head to the end wall. There were 2 candles on the mantelpiece, and 2 on each of the 3 tables that were in the room. I lit the lot, and after that, the room felt a little less inhumanly dreary, though mind you, it was quite fresh and well kept in every way. After I had taken a good look round, I sealed lengths of baby ribbon across the windows, along the walls, over the pictures, and over the fireplace and the wall closets. All the time as I worked, the butler stood just without the door, and I could not persuade him to enter, though I jested him a little as I stretched the ribbons and went here and there about my work. Every now and again he would say, "You'll excuse me, I'm sure, sir, but I do wish you would come out, sir. I'm fair and a quake for you." I told him he need not wait, but he was loyal enough in his way to what he considered his duty. He said he could not go away and leave me all alone there. He apologized, but made it very clear that I did not realize the danger of the room, and I could see, generally, that he was in a pretty frightened state. All the same, I had to make the room so that I should know if anything material entered it. So I asked him not to bother me, unless he really heard or saw something. He was beginning to get on my nerves, and the feel of the room was bad enough without making it any nastier. For a time further I worked, stretching ribbons across the floor and sealing them, so that the merest touch would have broken them, were anyone to venture into the room in that dark with the intention of playing the fool. All this had taken me far longer than I had anticipated, and suddenly I heard a clock strike 11. I had taken off my coat soon after commencing work. Now, however, as I had practically made an end of all that I intended to do, I walked across to the settee and picked it up. I was in the act of getting into it when the old butler's voice, he had not said a word for the last hour, came sharp and frightened. "Come out, sir, quick. There's something going to happen." Jove, but I jumped, and then in the same moment one of the candles on the table to the left went out. Now whether it was the wind or what, I do not know, but just for a moment I was enough startled to make a run for the door, though I am glad to say that I pulled up before I reached it. I simply could not bunk out with the butler standing there, after having, as it were, read him sort of a lesson on being brave, you know. So I just turned right round, picked up the 2 candles off the mantelpiece, and walked across to the table near the bed. Well, I saw nothing. I blew out the candle that was still alight, then I went to those on the 2 tables and blew them out. Then outside the door the old man called again. "Oh, sir, do be told, do be told." "All right, Peter," I said, and by Jove my voice was not as steady as I should have liked. I made for the door and had a bit of work not to start running. I took some thundering long strides, as you can imagine. Near the door I had a sudden feeling that there was a cold wind in the room. It was almost as if the window had been suddenly opened a little. I got to the door and the old butler gave back a step, in a sort of instinctive way. "Collar the candles, Peter," I said pretty sharply, and shoved them into his hands. I turned and caught the handle and slammed the door shut with a crash. Somehow, do you know, as I did so, I thought I felt something pull back on it, but it must have been only fancy. I turned the key in the lock and then again double-locking the door. I felt easier then, and set to and sealed the door. In addition, I put my card over the keyhole and sealed it there, after which I pocketed the key and went downstairs with Peter, who was nervous and silent leading the way. Poor old beggar. It had not struck me until that moment that he had been enduring a considerable strain during the last 2 or 3 hours. About midnight I went to bed. My room lay at the end of the corridor upon which opens the door of the grey room. I counted the doors between it and mine, and found that 5 rooms lay between, and I am sure you can understand that I was not sorry. Then, just as I was beginning to undress, an idea came to me, and I took my candle and sealing wax, and sealed the doors of all 5 rooms. If any door slammed in the night, I should know just which one. I returned to my room, locked the door, and went to bed. I was waked suddenly from a deep sleep by a loud crash somewhere out in the passage. I sat up in bed and listened, but heard nothing. Then I lit my candle. I was in the very act of lighting it when there came the bang of a door being violently slammed along the corridor. I jumped out of bed and got my revolver. I unlocked the door and went out into the passage holding my candle high and keeping the pistol ready. Then a queer thing happened. I could not go a step toward the grey room. You all know I am not really a cowardly chap. I've gone into too many cases connected with ghostly things to be accused of that. But I tell you I funked it. I simply funked it, just like any blessed kid. There was something precious unholy in the air that night. I ran back into my bedroom and shut and locked the door. Then I sat on the bed all night and listened to the dismal thudding of a door up the corridor. The sound seemed to echo through all the house. Daylight came at last and I washed and dressed. The door had not slammed for about an hour, and I was getting back my nerve again. I felt ashamed of myself, though. In some ways it was silly, for when you're meddling with that sort of thing, your nerve is bound to go sometimes, and you just have to sit quiet and call yourself a coward until daylight. Sometimes it is more than just cowardice, I fancy. I believe at times it is something warning you and fighting for you. But all the same, I always feel mean and miserable after a time like that. When the day came properly, I opened my door and, keeping my revolver handy, went quietly along the passage. I had to pass the head of the stairs along the way, and who should I see coming up but the old butler carrying a cup of coffee. He had merely tucked his nightshirt into his trousers, and he had an old pair of carpet slippers on. "Hello, Peter," I said, feeling suddenly cheerful, for I was as glad as any lost child to have a live human being close to me. "Where are you off to with the refreshments?" The old man gave a start and slopped some of the coffee. He stared up at me, and I could see that he looked white and done up. He came on up the stairs and held out the little tray to me. "I'm very thankful indeed, sir, to see you safe and well," he said. "I feared one time you might risk going into the grey room, sir. I've lain awake all night with the sound of the door, and when it came light I thought I'd make you a cup of coffee. I knew you'd want to look at the seals, and somehow it seems safer if there's two, sir." "Peter," I said, "you're a brick. This is very thoughtful of you," and I drank the coffee. "Come along," I told him, and handed him back the tray. "I'm going to have a look at what the brutes have been up to. I simply hadn't the pluck to in the night." "I'm very thankful, sir," he replied. "Flesh and blood can do nothing, sir, against devils, and that's what's in the grey room after dark." I examined the seals on all the doors as I went along, and found them right, but when I got to the grey room the seal was broken, though the card over the keyhole was untouched. I ripped it off and unlocked the door and went in, rather cautiously as you can imagine, but the whole room was empty of anything to frighten one, and there was heaps of light. I examined all my seals and not a single one was disturbed. The old butler had followed me in, and suddenly he called out, "The bedclothes, sir." I ran up to the bed and looked over, and surely they were lying in the corner to the left of the bed. Jove, you can imagine how queer I felt. Something had been in the room. I stared for a while from the bed to the clothes on the floor. I had a feeling that I did not want to touch either. Old Peter, though, did not seem to be affected that way. He went over to the bed coverings and was going to pick them up, as doubtless he had done every day these 20 years back, but I stopped him. I wanted nothing touched until I had finished my examination. This I must have spent a full hour over, and then I let Peter straighten up the bed, after which we went out, and I locked the door, for the room was getting on my nerves. I had a short walk and then breakfast, after which I felt more my own man, and so returned to the grey room, and with Peter's help and one of the maids, I had everything taken out of the room, except the bed, even the very pictures. I examined the walls, floor, and ceiling then, with probe, hammer, and magnifying glass, but found nothing suspicious, and I can assure you I began to realize in very truth that some incredible thing had been loose in the room during the past night. I sealed up everything again, and went out, locking and sealing the door, as before. After dinner, Peter and I unpacked some of my stuff, and I fixed up my camera and flashlight opposite to the door of the grey room, with a string from the trigger of the flashlight to the door. Then, you see, if the door were really opened, the flashlight would blare out, and there would be possibly a very queer picture to examine in the morning. The last thing I did before leaving was to uncap the lens, and after that I went off to my bedroom and to bed, for I intended to be up at midnight, and to ensure this, I set my little alarm to call me. Also, I left my candle burning. The clock woke me at 12, and I got up and into my dressing gown and slippers. I shoved my revolver into my right side pocket and opened my door. Then I lit my dark room lamp and withdrew the slide so that it would give a clear light. I carried it up the corridor about 30 feet and put it down on the floor, with the open side away from me so that it would show me anything that might approach along the dark passage. Then I went back and sat in the doorway of my room, with my revolver handy, staring up the passage toward the place where I knew my camera stood, outside the door of the grey room. I should think I had watched for about an hour and a half, when suddenly I heard a faint noise, away up the corridor. I was immediately conscious of a queer prickling sensation about the back of my head, and my hands began to sweat a little. The following instant the whole end of the passage flicked into sight in the abrupt glare of the flashlight. There came the succeeding darkness, and I peered nervously up the corridor, listening tensely, and trying to find what lay beyond the faint glow of my dark lamp, which now seemed ridiculously dim by contrast with the tremendous blaze of the flash power. And then, as I stooped forward, staring and listening, there came the crashing thud of the door of the grey room. The sound seemed to fill the whole of the large corridor, and go echoing hollowly through the house. I tell you I felt horrible, as if my bones were water, simply beastly. Jove! How did I stare, and how I listened. And then it came again. Thud, thud, thud. And then a silence that was almost worse than the noise of the door. For I kept fancying that some awful thing was stealing upon me along the corridor. And then suddenly my lamp was put out, and I could not see a yard before me. I realized all at once that I was doing a very silly thing, sitting there, and I jumped up. Even as I did so, I thought I heard a sound in the passage and quite near me. I made one backward spring into my room and slammed and locked the door. I sat on my bed and stared at the door. I had my revolver in my hand, but it seemed an abominably useless thing. I felt that there was something the other side of that door. For some unknown reason, I knew it was pressed up against the door, and it was soft. That was what I thought. Most extraordinary thing to think. Presently I got a hold of myself a bit, and marked out a pentacle, hurriedly with chalk on the polished floor, and there I sat in it, almost until dawn. And all the time away up the corridor the door of the grey room thudded, at solemn and horrid intervals. It was a miserable, brutal night. When the day began to break, the thudding of the door came gradually to an end, and at last I got hold of my courage, and went along the corridor in the half-light to cap the lens of my camera. I can tell you it took some doing, but if I had not done so, my photograph would have been spoilt, and I was tremendously keen to save it. I got back to my room and then set to and rubbed out the 5-pointed star in which I had been sitting. Half an hour later there was a tap at my door. It was Peter with my coffee. When I had drunk it, we both went along to the grey room. As we went, I had a look at the seals on the other doors, but they were untouched. The seal on the door of the grey room was broken, and also was the string from the trigger of the flashlight, but the card over the keyhole was still there. I ripped it off and opened the door. Nothing unusual was to be seen until we came to the bed. Then I saw that, as on the previous day, the bedclothes had been torn off and hurled into the left-hand corner, exactly where I had seen them before. I felt very queer, but I did not forget to look at all the seals, only to find that not one had been broken. Then I turned and looked at old Peter, and he looked at me, nodding his head. "Let's get out of here," I said. "It's no place for any living human to enter without proper protection." We went out, and I locked and sealed the door again. After breakfast I developed the negative, but it showed only the door of the grey room half opened. Then I left the house, as I wanted to get certain matters and implements that might be necessary to life, perhaps to the spirit, for I intended to spend the coming night in the grey room. I got back in the cab about 5:30 with my apparatus, and this, Peter and I carried up to the grey room, where I piled it carefully in the center of the floor. When everything was in the room, including a cat which I had brought, I locked and sealed the door and went toward the bedroom, telling Peter I should not be down for dinner. He said, "Yes, sir," and went downstairs thinking that I was going to turn in, which was what I wanted him to believe, as I knew he would have worried both me and himself if he had known what I intended. But I merely got my camera and flashlight from my bedroom and hurried back to the grey room. I locked and sealed myself in and set to work, for I had a lot to do before it got dark. First I cleared away all the ribbons across the floor, then I carried the cat, still fastened in its basket, over toward the far wall and left it. I returned then to the center of the room and measured out a space of 21 feet in diameter, which I swept with a broom of hyssop. About this I drew a circle of chalk, taking care never to step over the circle. Beyond this I smudged with a bunch of garlic, a broad belt right around the chalked circle, and when this was complete, I took from among my stores in the center of a small jar of a certain water. I broke away the parchment and withdrew the stopper. Then, dipping my left forefinger in the little jar, I went round the circle again, making upon the floor just within the line of chalk the second sign of the Sama ritual, and joining each sign most carefully with the left-handed crescent. I can tell you I felt easier when this was done and the water circle complete. Then I unpacked some more of the stuff that I had brought and placed a lighted candle in the valley of each crescent. After that I drew a pentacle so that each of the 5 points of the defensive star touched the chalk circle. In the 5 points of the star I placed 5 portions of the bread, each wrapped in linen, and in the 5 veils, 5 open jars of the water I had used to make the water circle. And now I had my first protective barrier complete. Now anyone except you who knows something of my methods of investigation might consider all this a piece of useless and foolish superstition, but you all remember the Black Veil case, in which I believe my life was saved by a very similar form of protection, whilst Astor, who sneered at it and would not come inside, died. I got the idea from the Sigsand manuscript, written, so far as I can make out, in the 14th century. At first, naturally, I imagined it was just an expression of the superstition of his time, and it was not until a year later that it occurred to me to test his defense, which I did, as I've just said, in that horrible black veil business. You know how that turned out. Later, I used it several times, and always I came through safe, until the moving fur case. It was only a partial defense, therefore, and I nearly died in the pentacle. After that, I came across Professor Gardner's experiments with a medium. When they surrounded the medium with a current and vacuum, he lost his power, almost as if it cut him off from the immaterial. That made me think a lot, and that is how I came to make the electric pentacle, which is the most marvelous defense against certain manifestations. I used the shape of the defensive star for this protection because I have, personally, no doubt at all but that there is some extraordinary virtue in the old magic figure. Curious thing for a 20th century man to admit, is it not? But then, as you all know, I never did and never will allow myself to be blinded by the little cheap laughter. I ask questions and keep my eyes open. In this last case, I had little doubt that I had run up against a supernatural monster, and I meant to take every possible care, for the danger is abominable. I turned now to fit the electric pentacle, setting it so that each of its points and veils coincided exactly with the points and veils of the drawn pentagram upon the floor. Then I connected up the battery, and the next instant the pale blue glare from the intertwining vacuum tubes shone out. I glanced about me then with something of a sigh of relief, and realized suddenly that the dusk was upon me, for the window was gray and unfriendly. Then round at the big, empty room, over the double barrier of electric and candlelight. I had an abrupt, extraordinary sense of weirdness thrust upon me. In the air, you know, as it were, a sense of something inhuman impending. The room was full of the stench of bruised garlic, a smell I hate. I turned now to the camera, and saw that it and the flashlight were in order. Then I tested my revolver carefully, though I had little thought that it would be needed. Yet to what extent materialization of an ab-natural creature is possible, given favorable conditions, no one can say. And I had no idea what horrible thing I was going to see, or feel the presence of. I might, in the end, have to fight with a materialized monster. I did not know, and could only be prepared. You see, I never forgot that 3 other people had been strangled in the bed close to me, and the fierce slamming of the door I had heard myself. I had no doubt that I was investigating a dangerous and ugly case. By this time the night had come, though the room was very light with the burning candles, and I found myself glancing behind me constantly, and then all round the room. It was nervy work waiting for that thing to come. Then suddenly, I was aware of a little, cold wind sweeping over me, coming from behind. I gave one great nerve thrill, and a prickly feeling went all over the back of my head. Then I hove myself round, with a sort of stiff jerk, and stared straight against that queer wind. It seemed to come from the corner of the room to the left of the bed, the place where both times I had found the heap of tossed bedclothes, yet I could see nothing unusual, no opening, no nothing. Abruptly I was aware that the candles were all a-flicker in that unnatural wind. I believe I just squatted there and stared in a horribly frightened, wooden way for some minutes. I shall never be able to let you know how disgustingly horrible it was sitting in that vile, cold wind. And then flick, 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 all the candles round the outer barrier went out, and there was I locked and sealed in that room, and with no light beyond the weakish blue glare of the electric pentacle. A time of abominable tenseness passed, and still that wind blew upon me, and then suddenly I knew that something stirred in the corner to the left of the bed. I was made conscious of it, rather by some inward, unused sense than by either sight or sound, for the pale, short radius glare of the pentacle gave but a very poor light for seeing by. Yet as I stared, something began slowly to grow upon my sight, a moving shadow, a little darker than the surrounding shadows. I lost the thing amid the vagueness, and for a moment or two, I glanced swiftly from side to side, with a fresh, new sense of impending danger. Then my attention was directed to the bed. All the coverings were being drawn steadily off, with a hateful, stealthy sort of motion. I heard the slow, dragging slither of the clothes, but I could see nothing of the thing that pulled. I was aware in a funny, subconscious, introspective fashion that the creep had come upon me, yet I was cooler mentally than I had been for some minutes, sufficiently so to feel that my hands were sweating coldly, and to shift my revolver, half-consciously, whilst I rubbed my right hand dry upon my knee, though never for an instant taking my gaze or my attention from those moving clothes. The faint noises from the bed ceased once, and there was a most intense silence, with only the sound of the blood beating in my head. Yet immediately afterward, I heard again the slurring of the bedclothes being dragged off the bed. In the midst of my nervous tension, I remembered the camera, and reached round for it, but without looking away from the bed. And then, all in a moment, the whole of the bed coverings were torn off with extraordinary violence, and I heard the flump they made as they were hurled into the corner. There was a time of absolute quietness then for perhaps a couple of minutes, and you can imagine how horrible I felt. The bedclothes had been thrown with such savageness, and then again the brutal unnaturalness of the thing that had just been done before me. Abruptly over by the door I heard a faint noise, a sort of crickling sound, and then a pitter or two upon the floor. A great nervous thrill swept over me, seeming to run up my spine and over the back of my head, for the seal that secured the door had just been broken. Something was there. I could not see the door, at least. I mean to say that it was impossible to say how much I actually saw, and how much my imagination supplied. Something was there. I could not see the door, at least I mean to say that it was impossible to say how much I actually saw, and how much my imagination supplied. I made it out, only as a continuation of the gray walls, and then it seemed to me that something dark and indistinct moved and wavered there among the shadows. Abruptly I was aware that the door was opening, and with an effort I reached again for my camera. But before I could aim it, the door was slammed with a terrific crash that filled the whole room with a sort of hollow thunder. I jumped, like a frightened child. There seemed such a power behind the noise, as though a vast, wanton force were out. Can you understand? The door was not touched again, but directly afterward, I heard the basket in which the cat lay creak. I tell you, I fairly pringled all along my back. I knew that I was going to learn definitely whether whatever was abroad was dangerous to life. From the cat there rose suddenly a hideous caterwaul that ceased abruptly, and then too late I snapped off the flashlight. In the great glare I saw that the basket had been overturned, and the lid was wrenched open, with the cat lying half in and half out upon the floor. I saw nothing else, but I was full of knowledge that I was in the presence of some being or thing that had power to destroy. During the next 2 or 3 minutes there was an odd, noticeable quietness in the room, and you must remember I was half blinded for the time because of the flashlight, so that the whole place seemed to be pitchy dark just beyond the shine of the pentacle. I tell you, it was most horrible. I just knelt there in the star and whirled round trying to see whether anything was coming at me. My power of sight came gradually, and I got a little hold of myself, and abruptly I saw the thing I was looking for close to the water circle. It was big and indistinct, and wavered curiously as though the shadow of a vast spider hung suspended in the air just beyond the barrier. It passed swiftly round the circle, and seemed to prove ever toward me, but only to draw back with extraordinary jerky movements, as might a living person if they touched the hot bar of a grate. Round and round it moved, and round I turned. Then just opposite to one of the veils and the pentacles, it seemed to pause, as though preliminary to a tremendous effort. It retired almost beyond the glow of the vacuum light, and then came straight toward me, appearing to gather form and solidity as it came. There seemed a vast, malign determination behind the movement that must succeed. I was on my knees, and I jerked back, falling onto my left hand and hip, in a wild endeavor to get back from the advancing thing. With my right hand I was grabbing madly for my revolver, which I had let slip. The brutal thing came with one great sweep straight over the garlic and the water circle, almost to the veil of the pentacle. I believe I yelled. Then just as suddenly as it had swept over, it seemed to be hurled back by some mighty invisible force. It must have been some moments before I realized that I was safe, and then I got myself together in the middle of the pentacles, feeling horribly gone and shaken, and glancing round and round the barrier, but the thing had vanished. Yet I had learned something, for I knew now that the gray room was haunted by a monstrous hand. Suddenly, as I crouched there, I saw what had so nearly given the monster an opening through the barrier. In my movements with the pentacle, I must have touched one of the jars of water, for just where the thing had made its attack, the jar that guarded the deep of the veil had been moved to one side, and this had left one of the 5 doorways unguarded. I put it back quickly, and felt almost safe again, for I had found the cause, and the defense was still good. I began to hope again that I should see the morning come in. When I saw that thing so nearly succeed, I had an awful, weak, overwhelming feeling that the barriers could never bring me safe through the night against such a force. You can understand. For a long time, I could not see the hand, but presently I thought I saw once or twice an odd wavering over among the shadows near the door. A little later, as though in a sudden fit of malignant rage, the dead body of the cat was picked up and beaten with dull, sickening blows against the solid floor. That made me feel rather queer. A minute afterward, the door was opened and slammed twice with tremendous force. The next instant, the thing made one swift, vicious dart at me from out of the shadows. Instinctively, I started sideways from it, and so plucked my hand from upon the electric pentacle, where for a wicked, careless moment I had placed it. The monster was hurled off from the neighborhood of the pentacles, though owing to my inconceivable foolishness, it had been enabled for a second time to pass the outer barriers. I can tell you I shook for a time with sheer funk. I moved right to the center of the pentacles again. I knelt there, making myself as small and compact as possible. As I knelt, there came to me presently a vague wonder at the two accidents which had so nearly allowed the brute to get at me. Was I being influenced to unconscious voluntary actions that endangered me? The thought took hold of me, and I watched my every movement. Abruptly, I stretched a tired leg and knocked over one of the jars of water. Some spilled, but because of my suspicious watchfulness, I had it upright and back within the veil, while yet some of the water remained. Even as I did so, the vast, black, half-materialized hand beat up at me out of the shadows, and seemed to leap almost into my face. So nearly did it approach, but for the third time it was thrown back by some altogether enormous, overmastering force. Yet apart from the dazed fright in which it left me, I had for a moment that feeling of spiritual sickness, as if some delicate, beautiful inward grace had suffered, which is felt only upon the too near approach of the abhuman, and is more dreadful, in a strange way, than any physical pain that can be suffered. I knew by this more of the extent and closeness of the danger, and for a long time I was simply cowed by the butt-headed brutality of that force upon my spirit. I can put it no other way. I knelt again in the center of the pentacles, watching myself with more fear, almost than the monster. For I knew now that unless I guarded myself from every sudden impulse that came to me, I might simply work my own destruction. Do you see how horrible it all was? I spent the rest of the night in a haze of sick fright, and so tense that I could not make a single movement naturally. I was in such fear that any desire for action that came to me might be prompted by the influence that I knew was at work on me. And outside of the barrier that ghastly thing went round and round, grabbing and grabbing in the air at me. Twice more was the body of the dead cat molested. The second time I heard every bone in its body scrunch and crack, and all the time the horrible wind was blowing upon me from the corner of the room to the left of the bed. Then, just as the first touch of dawn came into the sky, that unnatural wind ceased in a single moment, and I could see no sign of the hand. The dawn came slowly, and presently the wan light filled all the room, and made the pale glare of the electric pentacle look more unearthly. Yet it was not until the day had fully come that I made any attempt to leave the barrier, for I did not know but that there was some method abroad, in the sudden stopping of that wind, to entice me from the pentacles. At last, when dawn was strong and bright, I took one last look round and ran for the door. I got it unlocked in a nervous and clumsy fashion, and then locked it hurriedly and went to my bedroom, where I lay on the bed and tried to steady my nerves. Peter came presently with the coffee, and when I had drunk it I told him I meant to have a sleep, as I had been up all night. He took the tray and went out quietly, and after I had locked my door I turned in properly, and at last got to sleep. I woke about midday, and after some lunch went up to the gray room. I switched off the current from the pentacle which I had left on in my hurry. Also I removed the body of the cat. You can understand I did not want anyone to see the poor brute. After that, I made a very careful search of the corner where the bedclothes had been thrown. I made several holes and probed, and found nothing. Then it occurred to me to try with my instrument under the skirting. I did so and heard my wire ring on metal. I turned the hook end that way and fished for the thing. At the second go I got it. It was a small object, and I took it to the window. I found it to be a curious ring made of some graying material. The curious thing about it was that it was made in the form of a pentagon. That is, the same shape as the inside of the magic pentacle, but without the mounts, which formed the points of the defensive star. It was free from all chasing or engraving. You will understand that I was excited when I tell you that I felt sure I had in my hand the famous luck ring of the Anderson family, which indeed was of all things the one most intimately connected with the history of the haunting. This ring was handed on from father to son through generations, and always in obedience to some ancient family tradition. Each son had to promise never to wear the ring. The ring, I may say, was brought home by one of the Crusaders under very peculiar circumstances, but the story is too long to go into here. It appears that young Sir Hulbert, an ancestor of Anderson's, made a bet in drink, that he would wear the ring that night. He did so, and in the morning his wife and child were found strangled in the bed in the very room in which I stood. Many people, it would seem, thought young Sir Hulbert was guilty of having done this thing in drunken anger, and he, in an attempt to prove his innocence, slept a second night in the room. He also was strangled. Since then, as you may imagine, no one has ever spent a night in the Grey Room until I did so. The ring had been lost so long that it had become almost a myth, and it was most extraordinary to stand there with the actual thing in my hand, as you can understand. It was whilst I stood there, looking at the ring, that I got an idea, supposing that it were, in a way, a doorway. You see what I mean? A sort of gap in the world hedge. It was a queer idea, I know, and probably was not my own, but came to me from the outside. You see, the wind had come from that part of the room where the ring lay. I thought a lot about it. Then the shape, the inside of a pentacle. It had no mounts, and without mounts, as the Sigsand manuscript has it, the mounts which are the 5 hills of safety. To lack is to give power to the demon, and surely to favor the evil thing. You see, the very shape of the ring was significant, and I determined to test it. I unmade the pentacle, for it must be made afresh and around the one to be protected. Then I went out and locked the door, after which I left the house to get certain matters, for neither yarbs nor fire nor ware must be used a second time. I returned about 7:30, and as soon as the things I had brought had been carried up to the Grey Room, I dismissed Peter for the night just as I had done the evening before. When he had gone downstairs, I let myself into the room and locked and sealed the door. I went to the place in the center of the room where all the stuff had been packed and set to work with all my speed to construct a barrier about me and the ring. I do not remember whether I explained it to you, but I had reasoned that if the ring were in any way a medium of admission, and it were enclosed with me in the electric pentacle, it would be, to express it loosely, insulated. Do you see? The force, which had visible expression as a hand, would have to stay beyond the barrier, which separates the ab from the normal, for the gateway would be removed from accessibility. As I was saying, I worked with all my speed to get the barrier completed about me and the ring, for it was already later than I cared to be in that room unprotected. Also, I had a feeling that there would be a vast effort made that night to regain the use of the ring, for I had the strongest conviction that the ring was a necessity to materialization. You will see whether I was right. I completed the barriers in about an hour, and you can imagine something of the relief I felt when I felt the pale glare of the electric pentacle once more all about me. From then onward, for about 2 hours, I sat quietly facing the corner from which the wind came. About 11 o'clock, a queer knowledge came that something was near to me, yet nothing happened for a whole hour after that. Then suddenly I felt the cold, queer wind begin to blow upon me. To my astonishment, it seemed now to come from behind me, and I whipped round with a hideous quake of fear. The wind met me in the face. It was blowing up from the floor close to me. I stared down in a sickening maze of new frights. What on earth had I done now? The ring was there close beside me where I had put it. Suddenly, as I stared bewildered, I was aware that there was something queer about the ring. Funny, shadowy movements and convolutions. I looked at them stupidly, and then abruptly I knew that the wind was blowing up at me from the ring. A queer, indistinct smoke became visible to me, seeming to pour upward through the ring and mix with the moving shadows. Suddenly, I realized that I was in more than any mortal danger, for the convoluting shadows about the ring were taking shape, and the death hand was forming within the pentacle. My goodness, do you realize it? I had brought the gateway into the pentacles, and the brute was coming through, pouring into the material world as gas might pour out from the mouth of a pipe. I should think that I knelt for a moment in a sort of stunned fright. Then, with a mad, awkward movement, I snatched at the ring, intending to hurl it out of the pentacle, yet it eluded me, as though some invisible living thing jerked it hither and thither. At last I gripped it, yet in the same instant it was torn from my grasp with incredible and brutal force. A great black shadow covered it, and rose into the air and came at me. I saw that it was the hand, vast and nearly perfect in form. I gave one crazy yell and jumped over the pinnacle of the ring of burning candles, and ran despairingly for the door. I fumbled idiotically and ineffectually with the key, and all the time I stared with a fear that was like insanity toward the barriers. The hand was plunging toward me, Yet even as it had been unable to pass into the pinnacle when the ring was without, so now that the ring was within, it had no power to pass out. The monster was chained as surely as any beast would be, were chains riveted upon it. Even then I got a flash of this knowledge, but I was too utterly shaken with fright to reason. And the instant I managed to get the key turned, I sprang into the passage and slammed the door with a crash. I locked it and got to my room somehow, for I was trembling so that I could hardly stand, as you can imagine. I locked myself in and managed to get the candle lit. Then I lay down on my bed and kept quiet for an hour or two, and so I got steadied. I got a little sleep later, but woke when Peter brought my coffee. When I had drunk it, I felt altogether better, and took the old man along with me whilst I had a look into the grey room. I opened the door and peeped in. The candles were still burning, wan against the daylight, and behind them was the pale, glowing star of the electric pinnacle. And there in the middle was the ring, the gateway of the monster, lying demure and ordinary. Nothing in the room was touched, and I knew that the brute had never managed to cross the pinnacles. Then I went out and locked the door. After a sleep of some hours, I left the house. I returned in the afternoon in a cab. I had with me an oxy-hydrogen jet and 2 cylinders containing the gases. I carried the things into the grey room, and there, in the center of the electric pentacle, I erected the little furnace. 5 minutes later, the luck ring, once the luck, but now the bane of the Anderson family, was no more than a little solid splash of hot metal. Carnacki felt in his pocket and pulled out something wrapped in tissue paper. He passed it to me. I opened it and found a small circle of grayish metal, something like lead, only harder and rather brighter. "Well?" I asked at length, after examining it and handing it round to the others. "Did that stop the haunting?" Carnacki nodded. "Yes," he said. "I slept 3 nights in the grey room before I left. Old Peter nearly fainted when he knew that I meant to, but by the 3rd night he seemed to realize that the house was just safe and ordinary. And you know, I believe in his heart he hardly approved." Carnacki stood up and began to shake hands. "Out you go," he said genially, and presently we went, pondering, to our various homes. The Old Man of Visions by Algernon Blackwood. The image of Teufelsdrockh sitting in his watchtower, alone with the stars, leaped into my mind the moment I saw him, and the curious expression of his eyes proclaimed at once that here was a being who allowed the world of small effects to pass him by, while he himself dwelt among the eternal verities. It was only necessary to catch a glimpse of the bent gray figure, so slight, yet so tremendous, to realize that he carried staff and wallet and was traveling alone in a spiritual region, uncharted and full of wonder, difficulty, and fearful joy. The inner eye perceived this quite as clearly as the outer was aware of his Hebraic ancestry. But along what winding rivers, through what haunted woods, by the shores of what singing seas he pressed forward towards the mountains of his goal, no one could guess, from a mere inspection of that wonderful old face. To have stumbled upon such a figure in the casual way, it did seem incredible to me even at the time. Yet I at once caught something of the uplifting airs that followed this inhabitant of a finer world, and I spent days, and considered them well spent, trying to get into conversation with him, so that I might know something more than the thin disguise of his holding a reader's ticket for the museum library. To reach the stage of intimacy, where actual speech is a hindrance to close understanding, one need not in some cases have spoken at all. Thus, by merely setting my mind, and above all my imagination, into tune with his, and by steeping myself so much in his atmosphere that I absorbed, and then gave back to him with my own stamp the forces he exhaled, it was at length possible to persuade those vast seeing eyes to turn in my direction, and our glances having once met, I simply rose when he rose, and followed him out of the little smoky restaurant so closely up the street that our clothes brushed, and I thought I could even catch the sound of his breathing. Whether, having already weighed me, he accepted the office, or whether he was grateful for the arm to lean upon, with his many years of burden, I do not know. But the sympathy between us was such that, without a single word, we walked up that foggy London street to the door of his lodging in Bloomsbury. While I noticed that at the touch of his arm, the noise of the town seemed to turn into deep singing, and even the hurrying passers-by seemed bent upon noble purposes. and though he barely reached to my shoulder, and his gray beard almost touched my glove as I bent my arm to hold his own, there was something immense about his figure that sent him with towering stature above me and filled my thoughts with enchanting dreams of grandeur and high beauty. But it was only when the door had closed on him with a little rush of wind, and I was walking home alone, that I fully realized the shock of my return to Earth. And on reaching my own rooms, I shook with laughter to think I had walked 1.5 miles with a complete stranger without uttering a single syllable. Then the laughter suddenly hushed as I caught my face in the glass with the expression of the soul still lingering about the eyes and forehead, and for a brief moment my heart leaped to a sort of noble fever in the blood, leaving me with the smart of the soul's wings stirring beneath the body's crushing weight. And when it passed, I found myself dwelling upon the only words he had spoken when I left him at the door. "I am the old man of visions, and I am at your service." I think he never had a name, at least, it never passed his lips, and perhaps lay buried with so much else of the past that he clearly deemed unimportant. To me, at any rate, he became simply the old man of visions, and to the little waiting maid and the old landlady he was known simply as Mr. Mr. neither more nor less. The impenetrable veil that hung over his past never lifted for any vital revelations of his personal history, though he evidently knew all countries of the world, and had absorbed into his heart and brain the experience of all possible types of human nature. And there was an air about him not so much of "ask me no questions" as "do not ask me, for I cannot answer you in words." He could satisfy, but not in mere language. He would reveal, but by the wonderful words of silence only, for he was the old man of visions, and visions need no words. Being swift and of spirit, moreover, the landlady, poor, dusty, faded woman, the landlady stood in awe, and disliked being probed for information in a passageway down which he might any moment tread, for she could only tell me, "He just came in one night years ago, and he's been here ever since." And more than that, I never knew. Just came in one night, years ago. This adequately explained him, for where he came from, or was journeying to, was something quite beyond the scope of ordinary limited language. I pictured him suddenly turning aside from the stream of unimportant events, quietly stepping out of the world of straining, fighting, and shouting, and moving to take his rightful place among the forces of the still, spiritual region where he felt he belonged by virtue of long pain and difficult attainment. For he was unconnected with any conceivable network of relations, friends, or family, and his terrible aloofness could not be disturbed by anyone unless with his permission and by his express wish. Nor could he be imagined as belonging to any definite set of souls. He was apart from the world, and above it. But it was only when I began to creep a little nearer to him, and our strange, silent intimacy passed from mental to spiritual, that I began really to understand more of this wonderful old man of visions. Steeped in the tragedy and convulsed with laughter at the comedy of life, he yet lived there in his high attic wrapped in silence, as in a golden cloud. And so seldom did he actually speak to me that each time the sound of his voice that had something elemental in it, something of winds and waters, thrilled me with the power of the first time. He lived like Teufelsdrock, alone with the stars, and it seemed impossible more and more to link him on anywhere into practical dealings with ordinary men and women. Life somehow seemed to pass below him, yet the small, selfish spirit of the recluse was far from him, and he was tenderly and deeply responsive to pain and suffering, and more particularly to genuine yearning for the far things of beauty. The unsatisfied longings of others could move him at once to tears. "My relations with men are perfect," he said one night as we neared his dwelling. "I give them all sympathy out of my stores of knowledge and experience, and they give to me what kindness I need. The outer shell lies with impenetrable solitude, for only so can my inner life move freely along the paths and terraces that are thronged with the beings to whom I belong." And when I asked him how he maintained such deep sympathy with humanity, and had yet absolved himself apparently from actions as from speech, he stopped against an area railing and turned his great eyes to my face, as though their fires could communicate his thought without the husk of words. "I have peered too profoundly into life and beyond it," he murmured, "to wish to express in language what I know. Action is not for all, always, and I am in touch with the cisterns of thought that lie behind action. I ponder the mysteries. What I may solve is not lost for lack either of speech or action. For the true mystic is ever the true man of action, and my thought will reach others as soon as they are ready for it, in the same way that it reached you. All who strongly yearn must, sooner or later, find me and be comforted." His eyes shifted from my face toward the stars, softly shining above the dark museum roof, and a moment later he had disappeared into the hallway of his house. "An old poet who has strayed afield and lost his way," I mused. But through the door where he had just vanished, the words came back to me as from a great distance. A priest, rather, who has begun to find his way. For a space I stood, pondering on his face and words, that mercilessly intelligent look of the Hebrew woven in with the expression of the sadness of a whole race, yet touched with the glory of the Spirit, and his utterance, that he had passed through all the traditions and no longer needed a formal limited creed to hold to. I forgot how I reached my own door several miles away, but it seemed to me that I flew. In this way, and by unregistered degrees, we came to know each other better, and he accepted me and took me into his life. Always wrapped in the great calm of his delightful silence, he taught me more and told me more than could ever lie within the confines of mere words. And in moments of need, no matter when or where, I always knew exactly how to find him, reaching him in a few seconds by some swift way that disdained the means of ordinary locomotion. Then at last one day he gave me the key of his house, and the first time I found my way into his eyrie, and realized that it was a haven I could always fly to when the yearnings of the heart and soul struggled vainly for recompense, the full meaning and importance of the old man of visions became finally clear to me. The room, high up creaky darkened stairs in the ancient house, was bare and fireless, looking through a single patched window across a tumbled sea of roofs and chimneys. Yet there was that in it which instantly proclaimed it a little holy place out of the world, a temple in which someone with spiritual vitality had worshipped, prayed, wept, and sung. It was dusty and unswept, yet it was utterly unsoiled, and the old man of visions who lived there, for all his shabby and stained garments, his uncombed beard and broken shoes, stood within its door revealed in his real self, moving in a sort of divine whiteness, iridescent, shining, and here in this attic, lampless and unswept, high up under the old roofs of Bloomsbury, the windows scarred with rain, and the combers dropping cobwebs, I heard his silver whisper issue from the shadows. "Here, you may satisfy your soul's desire and may commune with the invisibles. Only, to find the invisibles, you must first be able to lose yourself." Oh, through that stained window pane, the sight leaping at a single bound from black roofs up to the stars. What pictures, dreams, and visions the old man has summoned to my eyes. Distances, measureless and impossible hitherto, became easy, and from the oppression of dead bricks and the marketplace he transported me in a moment to the slopes of the mountains of dream, leading me to a little place near the summits, where the pines grew thinly and the stars were visible through their branches, fading into the rose of dawn, where the winds tasted of the desert, and the voices of the wilderness fled upward with the sound of wings and falling streams. At his word, houses melted away, and the green waves of all the seas flowed into their places. Forests waved themselves into the coastlines of dull streets, and the power of the old earth, with all her smells and flowers and wild life, thrilled down among the dead roofs and caught me away into freedom among the sunshine of meadows and the music of sweet pipings. And with the divine deliverance came the crying of seagulls, the glimmer of reedy tarns, the whispering of wind among grasses, and the healing scorch of a real sun upon the skin. And poetry such as was never known or heard before clothed all he uttered, yet even then took no form in actual words, for it was of the substance of aspiration and yearning, voicing adequately all the busy, high-born dreams that haunt the soul yet never live in the uttered line. He breathed it about him in the air so that it filled my being. It was part of him, beyond words, and it sang my own longings, and sang them perfectly so that I was satisfied, for my own mood never failed to touch him instantly and to waken the right response. In essence, it was spiritual, the mystic poetry of heaven. Still, the love of humanity informed it, for star fire and heart's blood were about equally mingled there, while the mystery of unattainable beauty moved through it like a white flame. With other dreams and longings, too, it was the same, and all the most beautiful ideas that ever haunted a soul, undowered with expression here, floated with satisfied eyes and smiling lips before one, floated in silence, unencumbered, unlimited, unrestrained by words. In this dim room, never made ugly by artificial light, but always shadowy in a kind of gentle dusk, the old man of visions had only to lead me to the window to bring peace. Music that rendered the soul fluid as it poured across the old roofs into the room was summoned by him at need. And when one's wings beat sometimes against the prison walls, and the yearning for escape oppressed the heart, I have heard the little room rush and fill with the sound of trees, wind among the grasses, whispering branches, and lapping waters. The very odors of space and mountainside came too, and the looming of noble hills seemed visible overhead against the stars, as though the ceiling had suddenly become transparent. For the old man of visions had the power of instantly satisfying an ideal, when once that ideal created a yearning that could tear and burn its way out with sufficient force to set the will a-moving. But as the time passed and I came to depend more and more upon the intimacy with my strange old friend, new light fell upon the nature and possibilities of our connection. I discovered, for instance, that though I held the key to his dwelling and was familiar with the way, he was nevertheless not always available. Two things in different fashion rendered him inaccessible or mute, and for the first I gradually learned that when life was prosperous and the body singing loud, I could not find my way to his house. No amount of wandering, calculation, or preserving effort enabled me even to find the street again. With any burst of worldly success, however fleeting, the old man of visions somehow slipped away into remote shadows and became unreal and misty. A merely passing desire to be with him, to seek his inspiration by a glimpse through that magic window pane, resulted only in vain and tiresome pacing to and fro along ugly streets that produced weariness and depression. And after these periods it became, I noticed, less and less easy to discover the house, to fit the key in the door, or, having gained access to the temple, to realize the visions I thought I craved for. Often in this way have I searched in vain for days, but only succeeded in losing myself in the murky purlieus of quite a strange Bloomsbury, stopping outside numberless counterfeit doors, and struggling vainly with locks that knew nothing of my little shining key. But on the other hand, pain, loneliness, sorrow, the merest whisper of spiritual affliction, and lo, in a single moment the difficult geography became plain, and without hesitation, when I was unhappy or distressed, I found the way to his house as by a bird's instinctive flight, and the key slipped into the lock as though it loved it and was returning home. The other cause to render him inaccessible, though not so determined, since it never concealed the way to the house, was even more distressing, for it depended wholly on myself, and I came to know how the least ugly action, involving a depreciation of ideals, so confused the mind that, when I got into the house with difficulty and found him in the little room after much searching, he was able to do or say scarcely anything at all for me. The mirror facing the door then gave back, I saw, no proper reflection of his person, but only a faded and wavering shadow with dim eyes and stooping, indistinct outline, and I even fancied I could see the pattern of the wall and shape of the furniture through his body, as though he had grown semi-transparent. "You must not expect yearnings to weigh," came his whisper like wind far overhead, "unless you lend them your own substance, and your own substance you cannot both keep and lend. If you would know the invisibles, forget yourself." And later, as the years slipped away one after another into the mists, and the frontier between the real and the unreal began to shift amazingly with his teachings, it became more and more clear to me that he belonged to a permanent region that, with all the changes in the world's history, has itself never altered in any essential particular. This immemorial old man of visions, as I grew to think of him, had existed always. He was old as the sea and coeval with the stars, and he dwelt beyond time and space, reaching out a hand to all those who, weary of the shadows and illusions of practical life, really call to them with their heart of hearts. To me, indeed, the touch of sorrow was always near enough to prevent his becoming often inaccessible, and after a while even his voice became so living that I sometimes heard it calling to me in the street and in the fields. O wonderful old man of visions! Happy the days of disaster since they taught me how to know you, the unraveler of problems, the destroyer of doubts, who bore me ever away with soft flight down the long, long vistas of the heart and soul. And his loneliness in that temple attic under the stars, his loneliness, too, had a meaning I did not fail to understand later, and why he was always available for me and seemed to belong to no other. "To everyone who finds me,"
he said with the strange smile that wrapped his whole being and not his face alone. To everyone I am the same, and yet different. I am not really ever alone. The whole world, nay, his voice rose to a singing cry, the whole universe in this room, or just beyond the window pane, for here past and future meet, and all real dreams find completeness. But remember, he added, and there was a sound as of soft wind and rain in the room with his voice, no true dream can ever be shared, and should you seek to explain to me another, you must lose me beyond recall. You have never asked me my name, nor must you ever tell it. Each must find me in his own way. Yet one day, for all my knowledge and his warnings, I felt so sure of my intimacy with this immemorial being that I spoke of him to a friend who was, I had thought, so much a part of myself that it seemed no betrayal. And my friend, who went to search and found nothing, returned with the fool's laughter on his face, and swore that no street or number existed, for he had looked in vain, and had repeatedly asked the way. And from that day to this, the old man of visions has neither called to me, nor let his place be found. The streets are strange and empty, and I have even lost the little shining key.
The Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Part 1. It is an ancient mariner, and he stoppeth, one of three, by thy long grey beard and glittering eye. Now wherefore stoppest thou me? The bridegroom's doors are opened wide, and I am next of kin. The guests are met, the feast is set, mayst hear the merry din. He holds him with his skinny hand, there was a ship, quoth he. Hold off, unhand me, grey-beard loon. Eftsoons his hand dropped he. He holds him with his glittering eye, the wedding guest stood still, and he listens like a 3 years' child, the mariner hath his will. The wedding guest sat on a stone, he cannot choose but hear, and thus spake on that ancient man, the bright-eyed mariner. The ship was cheered, the harbour cleared, merrily did we drop, below the kirk, below the hill, below the lighthouse top. The sun came up upon the left, out of the sea came he, and he shone bright, and on the right went down into the sea. Till over the mast at noon, the wedding guest here beat his breast, for he heard the loud bassoon. The bride hath paced into the hall, red as a rose is she, nodding their heads before her goes the merry minstrelsy. The wedding guest he beat his breast, yet he cannot choose but hear, and thus spake on the ancient man, the bright-eyed mariner. And now the storm blast came, and he was tyrannous and strong. He struck with his o'ertaking wings, and chased us south along, with sloping masts and dipping prow, as who pursued with yell and blow, still treads the shadow of his foe. And forward bends his head, the ship drove fast, loud roared the blast, and southward, aye, we fled. And now there came both mist and snow, and it grew wondrous cold, and ice mast high came floating by, as green as emerald. And through the drifts the snowy cliffs did send a dismal sheen, nor shapes of men nor beast we ken, the ice was all between. The ice was here, the ice was there, the ice was all around. It cracked and growled and roared and howled, like noises in a swound. At length did cross an albatross, through the fog it came, as if it had been a Christian soul, we hailed it in God's name. It ate the food it ne'er had ate, and round it flew. The ice did split with a thunder fit, the helmsman steered us through. And a good south wind sprung up behind, the albatross did follow, and every day for food or play came to the mariner's hollow. In mist or cloud, on mast or shroud, it perched for vespers 9, whiles all the night through fog smoke white glimmered the white moonshine. God save thee, ancient mariner, from the fiends that plague thee thus. Why lookest thou so? With my crossbow I shot the albatross. Part 2. The sun now rose upon the right, out of the sea he came, still hid in mist, and on the left went down into the sea. And the good south wind still blew behind, but no sweet bird did follow, nor any day for food or play came to the mariner's hollow. And I had done a hellish thing, and it would work 'em woe,
For all averred I had killed the bird that made the breeze to blow. Ah, wretch, said they, the bird to slay that made the breeze to blow. Nor dim nor red, like God's own head, the glorious sun uprist. Then all averred I had killed the bird that brought the fog and mist. 'Twas right, said they, such birds to slay that bring the fog and mist. The fair breeze blew, the white foam flew, the furrow followed free. We were the first that ever burst into that silent sea. Down dropped the breeze, the sails dropped down. 'Twas sad as sad could be, and we did speak only to break the silence of the sea. All in a hot and copper sky, the bloody sun at noon, right up above the mast did stand, no bigger than the moon. Day after day, we stuck nor breath nor motion, as idle as a painted ship upon a painted ocean. Water, water, everywhere, and all the boards did shrink. Water, water, everywhere, nor any drop to drink. The very deep did rot, O Christ, that ever this should be, yet slimy things did crawl with legs upon the slimy sea. About, in reel and rout, the death fires danced at night. The water like a witch oils burnt green and blue and white. And some in dreams assured were of the spirit that plagued us so. 9 fathom deep he has followed us from the land of mist and snow. And every tongue through utter draught was withered at the root. We could not speak no more than if we had been choked with soot. Ah, well a day, what evil looks had I from old and young. Instead of the cross, the albatross about my neck was hung. Part 3. There passed a weary time, each throat was parched and glazed each eye. A weary time, how glazed each weary eye. When looking westward I beheld a something in the sky. At first it seemed a little speck, and then it seemed a mist. It moved and took at last a certain shape I wist. A speck, a mist, a shape I wist, and still it neared and neared. As if it dodged a water sprite, it plunged and tacked and veered. With throats unslaked, with black lips baked, we could not laugh nor wail. Through utter draught, all dumb we stood. I bit my arm, I sucked the blood, and cried, a sail, a sail. With throats unslaked, with black lips baked, agape they heard me call. Gramercy, they for joy did grin, and all at once their breath drew in, as they were drinking all. See, I cried, she tacks no more, hither to work us wheel. Without a breeze, without a tide, she steadies with upright keel. The western wave was all aflame, the day was well nigh done. Almost upon the western wave rested the broad bright sun, when that strange ship drove suddenly betwixt us and the sun. And straight the sun was flecked with bars. Heaven's mother send us grace. As if through a dungeon grate he peered, with broad and burning face. Alas, thought I, and my heart beat loud, how fast she nears and nears. Are those her sails that glance in the sun, like restless gossameres? Are those her ribs through which the sun did peer as through a grate? And is that woman all her crew? Is that a death, and are there two? Is death that woman's mate? Her lips were red, her looks were free, her locks were yellow as gold. Her skin was white as leprosy. The nightmare life and death was she, who thicks man's blood with cold. The naked hulk alongside came, and twain were casting dice. The game is done, I've won, quoth she, and whistles thrice. The sun's rim dips, the stars rush out, at one stride comes the dark. With far-heard whisper, o'er the sea, off shot the spectre bark. We listened and looked sideways up, fear at my heart, as at a cup, my lifeblood seemed to sip. The stars were dim, and thick the night. The steersman's face by his lamp gleamed white. From the sails the dew did drip. Till clomb above the eastern bar, the horned moon with one bright star, within the nether tip. One after one by the star-dogged moon, too quick for groan or sigh, each turned his face with a ghastly pang, and cursed me with his eye. 4 times 50 living men, and I heard nor sigh nor groan. With heavy thump, a lifeless lump, they dropped down one by one. The souls did from their bodies fly, they fled to bliss or woe, and every soul it passed me by, like the whiz of my crossbow.
Part 4.
I fear thee, ancient mariner, I fear thy skinny hand, and thou art long and lank and brown, as is the ribbed sea sand. I fear thee and thy glittering eye, and thy skinny hand so brown. Fear not, thou wedding guest, this body drop not down. Alone, alone, all alone, alone on a wide, wide sea, and never a saint took pity on my soul in agony. The many men so beautiful, and they all dead did lie, and 1,000 slimy things lived on, and so did I. I looked upon the rotting sea and drew my eyes away. I looked upon the rotting deck, and there the dead men lay. I looked to heaven and tried to pray, but or ever a prayer had gushed, a wicked whisper came and made my heart as dry as dust. I closed my lids and kept them close, and the balls like pulses beat, for the sky and the sea and the sea and the sky lay dead like a load on my weary eye, and the dead were at my feet. The cold sweat melted from their limbs, nor rot nor reek did they. The look with which they looked on me had never passed away. An orphan's curse would drag to hell a spirit from on high, but oh, more horrible than that is the curse in a dead man's eye. 7 days, 7 nights I saw that curse, and yet I could not die. The moving moon went up the sky, and nowhere did abide. Softly she was going up, and a star or two beside. Her beams bemocked the sultry main, like April hoarfrost spread, but where the ship's huge shadow lay, the charmed water burnt alway, a still and awful red. Beyond the shadow of the ship, I watched the water snakes. They moved in tracks of shining white, and when they reared the elfish light, fell off in hoary flakes. Within the shadow of the ship, I watched their rich attire, blue glossy green and velvet black. They coiled and swam, and every track was a flash of golden fire. O happy living things no tongue their beauty might declare. A spring of love gushed from my heart, and I blessed them unaware. Sure my kind saint took pity on me, and I blessed them unaware. The self-same moment I could pray, and from my neck so free, the albatross fell off and sank, like lead into the sea.
Part 5.
O sleep, it is a gentle thing, beloved from pole to pole. To Mary Queen the praise be given, she sent the gentle sleep from heaven that slid into my soul. The silly buckets on the deck that had so long remained, I dreamt that they were filled with dew, and when I awoke, it rained. My lips were wet, my throat was cold, my garments all were dank. Sure I had drunken in my dreams, and still my body drank. I moved and could not feel my limbs, I was so light almost. I thought that I had died in sleep and was a blessed ghost. And soon I heard a roaring wind. It did not come anear, but with its sound it shook the sails that were so thin and sere. The upper air burst into life, and 100 fire flags sheen. To and fro they were hurried about, and to and fro and in and out the wan stars danced between. And the coming wind did roar more loud, and the sails did sigh like sledge, and the rain poured down from one black cloud. The moon was at its edge. The thick black cloud was cleft and still, the moon was at its side. Like waters shot from some high crag, the lightning fell with never a jag, a river steep and wide. The loud wind never reached the ship, yet now the ship moved on. Beneath the lightning and the moon, the dead men gave a groan. They groaned and stirred, they all uprose, nor spake nor moved their eyes. It had been strange even in a dream to have seen those dead men rise. The helmsman steered, the ship moved on, yet never a breeze up blew. The mariners all 'gan work the ropes, where they were wont to do. They raised their limbs like lifeless tools, we were a ghastly crew. The body of my brother's son stood by me knee to knee. The body and I pulled at one rope, but he said naught to me. I fear thee, ancient mariner, be calm, thou wedding guest. 'Twas not those souls that fled in pain, which to their corpse came again, but a troop of spirits blessed. For when it dawned they dropped their arms, and clustered round the mast. Sweet sounds rose slowly through their mouths, and from their bodies passed. Around flew each sweet sound, then darted to the sun. Slowly the sounds came back again, now mixed, now one by one. Sometimes a dropping from the sky I heard the skylarks sing, sometimes all little birds that are, how they seemed to fill the sea and air with their sweet jargoning. And now 'twas like all instruments, now like a lonely flute, and now it is an angel's song that makes the heavens be mute. It ceased, yet still the sails made on, a pleasant noise till noon, a noise like of a hidden brook in the leafy month of June, that to the sleeping woods all night singeth a quiet tune. Till noon we quietly sailed on, yet never a breeze did breathe. Slowly and smoothly went the ship, moved onward from beneath. Under the keel, 9 fathom deep, from the land of mist and snow, the spirit slid, and it was he that made the ship to go. The sails at noon left off their tune, and the ship stood still also. The sun right up above the mast had fixed her to the ocean, but in a minute she 'gan stir, with a short uneasy motion, backwards and forwards half her length, with a short uneasy motion. Then like a pawing horse let go, she made a sudden bound. It flung the blood into my head, and I fell down in a swound. How long in that same fit I lay, I have not to declare, but ere my living life returned, I heard in my soul, discerned, 2 voices in the air. Is it he, quoth one, is this the man, by him who died on cross? With his cruel bow he laid full low the harmless albatross. The spirit who bideth by himself in the land of mist and snow, he loved the bird that loved the man who shot him with his bow. The other was a softer voice, as soft as honey dew. Quoth he, the man hath penance done, and penance more will do. But tell me, speak again, thy soft response renewing. What makes that ship drive on so fast? What is the ocean doing? Still as a slave before his lord, the ocean hath no blast. His great bright eye most silently up to the moon is cast. If he may know which way to go, for she guides him smooth or grim. See, brother, see how graciously she looketh down on him. But why drives on that ship so fast, without or wave or wind? The air is cut away before, and closes from behind. Fly, brother, fly, more high, or we shall be belated. For slow and slow that ship will go, when mariner's trance is abated. I woke and we were sailing on, as in a gentler weather. 'Twas night, calm night, the moon was high, the dead men stood together. All stood together on the deck for a charnel dungeon fitter, all fixed on me their stony eyes, that in the moon did glitter. The pang, the curse with which they died, had never passed away. I could not draw my eyes from theirs, nor turn them up to pray. And now this spell was snapped once more, I viewed the ocean green, and looked far forth, yet little saw of what had else been seen. Like one that on a lonesome road doth walk in fear and dread, and having once turned round walks on, and turns no more his head, because he knows a frightful fiend doth close behind him tread. But soon there breathed a wind on me, nor sound nor motion made. Its path was not upon the sea, in ripple or in shade. It raised my hair, it fanned my cheek, like a meadow gale of spring. It mingled strangely with my fears, yet it felt like a welcoming. Swiftly, swiftly flew the ship, yet she sailed softly too. Sweetly, sweetly blew the breeze, on me alone it blew. O dream of joy, is this indeed the lighthouse top I see? Is this the hill? Is this the kirk? Is this mine own country? We drifted o'er the harbour bar, and I with sobs did pray, O let me be awake, my God, or let me sleep alway. The harbour bay was clear as glass, so smoothly it was strewn, and on the bay the moonlight lay, and the shadow of the moon. The rock shone bright, the kirk no less, the stands above the rock, the moonlight steeped in silentness, the steady weathercock. And the bay was white with silent light, till rising from the same, full many shapes the shadows were, in crimson colors came. A little distance from the prow, those crimson shadows were. I turned my eyes upon the deck, O Christ, what I saw there! Each corpse lay flat, lifeless and flat, and by the holy rood, A man all light, a seraph man, on every corpse there stood. This seraph band each waved his hand, it was a heavenly sight. They stood as signals to the land, each one a lovely light. This seraph band each waved his hand, no voice did they impart, no voice, but oh, the silence sank like music on my heart. But soon I heard the dash of oars, I heard the pilot's cheer. My head was turned perforce away, and I saw a boat appear. The pilot and the pilot's boy, I heard them coming fast. Dear Lord in heaven, it was a joy the dead men could not blast. I saw a third, I heard his voice, it is the hermit good. He singeth loud his godly hymns that he makes in the wood. He'll shrieve my soul, he'll wash away the albatross's blood. Part 7. This hermit good lives in that wood, which slopes down to the sea. How loudly his sweet voice he rears. He loves to talk with mariners that come from a far country. He kneels at morn and noon and eve. He hath a cushion plump. It is the moss that wholly hides the rotted old oak stump. The skiff boat neared. I heard them talk. Why, this is strange, I trow. Where are those lights so many and fair that signal made but now? Strange by my faith, the hermit said, and they answered not our cheer. The planks look warped, and see those sails, how thin they are and sere. I never saw aught like to them, unless perchance it were. Brown skeletons of leaves that lag my forest brook along, when the ivy tod is heavy with snow, and the owlet whoops to the wolf below that eats the she-wolf's young. Dear Lord, it hath a fiendish look, the pilot made reply. I am afeard, push on, said the hermit cheerily. The boat came closer to the ship, but I nor spake nor stirred. The boat came close beneath the ship, and straight a sound was heard. Under the water it rumbled on, still louder and more dread. It reached the ship, it split the bay, the ship went down like lead. Stunned by that loud and dreadful sound which sky and ocean smote, like one that hath been 7 days drowned, my body lay afloat. But swift as dreams myself I found within the pilot's boat. Upon the whirl where sank the ship, the boat spun round, and all was still, save that the hill was telling of the sound. I moved my lips, the pilot shrieked, and fell down in a fit. The holy hermit raised his eyes, and prayed where he did sit. I took the oars, the pilot's boy, who now doth crazy go, laughed loud and long, and all the while his eyes went to and fro. Ha ha, quoth he, full plain I see, the devil knows how to row. And now all in my own country, I stood on the firm land. The hermit stepped forth from the boat, and scarcely he could stand. Oh, shrieve me, holy man. The hermit crossed his brow. Say quick, quoth he, I bid thee say, what manner of man art thou? Forthwith this frame of mine was wrenched with a woeful agony, which forced me to begin my tale, and then it left me free. Since then at an uncertain hour this agony returns, and till my ghastly tale is told, this heart within me burns. I pass like night from land to land, I have strange power of speech. That moment that his face I see, I know the man that must hear me, to him my tale I teach. What loud uproar bursts from that door, the wedding guests are there, but in the garden bower the bride and bridemaids singing are. And hark the little vesper bell, which biddeth me to prayer. O wedding guest, this soul hath been alone on a wide, wide sea. So lonely 'twas that God himself scarce seemed there to be. O sweeter than the marriage feast, 'tis sweeter far to me, to walk together to the kirk with a goodly company. To walk together to the kirk, and all together pray, while each to his great Father bends, old men and babes and loving friends, and youths and maidens gay. Farewell, farewell, but this I tell, to thee thou wedding guest, he prayeth well who loveth well, both man and bird and beast. He prayeth best who loveth best, all things both great and small, for the dear God who loveth us, he made and loveth all. The mariner whose eye is bright, whose beard with age is hoar, is gone, and now the wedding guest turned from the bridegroom's door. He went like one that hath been stunned, and is of sense forlorn. A sadder and a wiser man, he rose the morrow morn.
The Devotee of Evil by Clark Ashton Smith. The old Larkham house was a mansion of considerable size and dignity, set among oaks and cypresses on the hill behind Auburn's Chinatown, in what had once been the aristocratic section of the village. At the time which I write, it had been unoccupied for several years, and had begun to present the signs of desolation and dilapidation, which untenanted houses so soon display. The place had a tragic history and was believed to be haunted. I had never been able to procure any first-hand or precise accounts of the spectral manifestations that were accredited to it, but certainly it possessed all the necessary antecedents of a haunted house. The first owner, Judge Peter Larkham, had been murdered beneath its roof back in the 70s by a maniacal Chinese cook. One of his daughters had gone insane, and 2 other members of the family had died accidental deaths. None of them had prospered. Their legend was one of sorrow and disaster. Some later occupants who had purchased the place from the one surviving son of Peter Larkham had left under circumstances of inexplicable haste after a few months, moving permanently to San Francisco. They did not return even for the briefest visit, and beyond paying their taxes, they gave no attention whatever to the place. Everyone had grown to think of it as a sort of historic ruin when the announcement came that it had been sold to Jean Averot of New Orleans. My first meeting with Averot was strangely significant, for it revealed to me, as years of acquaintance would not necessarily have done, the peculiar bias of his mind. Of course, I had already heard some odd rumors about him. His personality was too signal, his advent too mysterious to escape the usual fabrication and mongering of village tales. I had been told that he was extravagantly rich, that he was a recluse of the most eccentric type, that he had made certain very singular changes in the inner structure of the old house, and last but not least, that he lived with a beautiful mulatress who never spoke to anyone and who was believed to be his mistress as well as his housekeeper. The man himself had been described to me by some as an unusual but harmless lunatic, and by others as an all-round Mephistopheles. I had seen him several times before our initial meeting. He was a sallow, saturnine Creole, with the marks of race in his hollow cheeks and feverish eyes. I was struck by his air of intellect and by the fiery fixity of his gaze, the gaze of a man who is dominated by one idea to the exclusion of all else. Some medieval alchemist who believed himself to be on the point of attaining his objective after years of unrelenting research might have looked as he did. I was in the Auburn Library one day when Averot entered. I had taken a newspaper from one of the tables and was reading the details of an atrocious crime, the murder of a woman and her 2 infant children by the husband and father, who had locked his victims in a clothes closet after saturating their garments with oil. He had left the woman's apron string caught in the shut door, with the end protruding, and had set fire to it like a fuse. Averot passed the table where I was reading. I looked up and saw his glance at the headlines of the paper I held. A moment later he returned and sat down beside me, saying in a low voice, "What interests me in a crime of that sort is the implication of unhuman forces behind it. Could any man, on his own initiative, have conceived and executed anything so gratuitously fiendish?" "I do not know," I replied, somewhat surprised by the question and by my interrogator. "There are terrifying depths in the human nature more abhorrent than those of the jungle." "I agree. But how could such impulses unknown to the most brutal progenitors of man have been implanted in his nature, unless through some ulterior agency?" "You believe then in the existence of an evil force or entity, a Satan or an Ahriman?" "I believe in evil. How can I do otherwise when I see its manifestations everywhere? I regard it as an all-controlling power, but I do not think that the power is personal in the sense of what we know as personality. A Satan? No. What I conceive is a sort of dark vibration, the radiation of a black sun, of a center of malignant eons. A radiation that can penetrate like any other ray, and perhaps more deeply, but probably I don't make my meaning clear at all." I protested that I understood him, but after his burst of communicativeness, he seemed oddly disinclined to pursue the conversation. Evidently, he had been prompted to address me, and no less evidently he regretted having spoken with so much freedom. He arose, but before leaving he said, "I am Jean Averot. Perhaps you have heard of me. You are Philip Hastane, the novelist. I have read your books, and I admire them. Come and see me sometime. We may have certain tastes in common." Averot's personality, the conception he had avowed,
and the intense interest and value which he so obviously attached to these conceptions made a singular impression on my mind, and I could not forget him. When a few days later I met him on the street and he repeated his invitation with a cordialness that was unfeignedly sincere, I could do no less than accept. I was interested, though not altogether attracted, by his bizarre, well-nigh morbid individuality, and was impelled by a desire to learn more concerning him. I sensed a mystery of no common order, a mystery with elements of the abnormal and the uncanny. The grounds of the old Larkham place were precisely as I remembered them, though I had not found occasion to pass them for some time. They were a veritable tangle of Cherokee rose vines, arbutus, lilac, ivy, and creep myrtle, half overshadowed by the great cypresses and somber evergreen oaks. There was a wild, half-sinister charm about them, the charm of rampancy and ruin. Nothing had been done to put the place in order, and there were no outward repairs in the house itself, where the white paint of bygone years was being slowly replaced by mosses and lichens that flourished beneath the eternal umbrage of the trees. There were signs of decay in the roof and pillars of the front porch, and I wondered why the new owner, who was reputed to be so rich, had not already made the necessary restorations. I raised the gargoyle-shaped knocker and let it fall with a dull, lugubrious clang. The house remained silent, and I was about to knock again when the door opened slowly, and I saw for the first time the mulatress of whom so many village rumors had reached me. The woman was more exotic than beautiful, with fine, mournful eyes and bronze-colored features of a semi-negroid irregularity. Her figure, though, was truly perfect, with the curving lines of a lyre and the supple grace of some feline animal. When I asked for Jean Avero, she merely smiled and made signs for me to enter. I surmised at once that she was dumb. Waiting in the gloomy library to which she conducted me, I could not refrain from glancing at the volumes with which the shelves were congested. They were an ungodly jumble of tomes that dealt with anthropology, ancient religions, demonology, modern science, history, psychoanalysis, and ethics. Interspersed with these were a few romances and volumes of poetry. Basabre's monograph of Manichaeism was flanked with Byron and Poe, and Lafleur's de Mal jostled a late treatise on chemistry. Avero entered after several minutes, apologizing profusely for his delay. He said that he had been in the midst of certain labors when I came, but he did not specify the nature of these labors. He looked even more hectic and fiery-eyed than when I had seen him last. He was patently glad to see me, and eager to talk. "You have been looking at my books," he observed immediately. "Though you might not think so at first glance, on account of their seeming diversity. I have selected them all with a single object, the study of evil in all its aspects, ancient, medieval, and modern. I have traced it in the religions and demonologies of all peoples, and more than this, in human history itself. I have found in the inspiration of poets and romancers who have dealt with the darker impulses, emotion and acts of man. Your novels have interested me for this reason. You are aware of the baneful influences which surround us, which so often sway or actuate us. I have followed the working of these agencies even in chemical reactions, in the growth and decay of trees, flowers, minerals. I feel that the processes of physical decomposition, as well as the similar mental and moral processes, are due entirely to them. In brief, I have postulated a monistic evil, which is the source of all death, deterioration, imperfection, pain, sorrow, madness, and disease. This evil, so feebly counteracted by the powers of good, allures and fascinates me above all things. For a long time past, my life work has been to ascertain its true nature and trace it to its fountainhead. I am sure that somewhere in space there is the center from which all evil emanates." He spoke with a wild air of excitement, of morbid and semi-maniacal intensity. His obsession convinced me that he was more or less unbalanced, but there was an unholy logic in the development of his ideas, and I could not but recognize a certain disordered brilliancy and range of intellect. Scarcely waiting for me to reply, he continued his monologue. "I have learned that certain localities and buildings, certain arrangements of natural or artificial objects, are more favorable to the reception of evil influences than others. The laws that determine the degree of receptivity are still obscure to me, but at least I have verified the fact itself. As you know, there are houses or neighborhoods notorious for a succession of crimes or misfortunes. And there are also articles, such as certain jewels, whose possession is accompanied by disaster. Such places and things are receivers of evil. I have a theory, however, that there is always more or less interference with the direct flow of the malignant force, and that pure, absolute evil has never yet been manifested. By the use of some device which would create a proper field or form a receiving station, it should be possible to evoke this absolute evil. Under such conditions, I am sure that the dark vibration would become a visible and tangible thing, comparable to light or electricity. Then he eyed me with a gaze that was disconcertingly exigent. Then, I will confess that I have purchased this old mansion and its grounds mainly on account of their baleful history. The place is unusually liable to the influences of which I have spoken. I am now at work on an apparatus by means of which, when it is perfected, I hope to manifest in their essential purity the radiations of malign force. At this moment the Mulatress entered and passed through the room on some household errand. I thought that she gave Avaro a look of maternal tenderness, watchfulness, and anxiety. He on his part seemed hardly to be aware of her presence, so engrossed was he in the strange ideas and the stranger project he had been expounding. However, when she had gone, he remarked, "That is Fifine, the one human being who is really attached to me. She is mute, but highly intelligent and affectionate. All my people, an old Louisiana family, are long departed, and my wife is doubly dead to me." A spasm of obscure pain contracted his features and vanished. He resumed his monologue, and at no future time did he again refer to the presumably tragic tale at which he had hinted. A tale in which I sometimes suspect were hidden the seeds of the strange moral and mental perversion which he was to manifest more and more. I took my leave after promising to return for another talk. Of course, I considered now that Avaro was a madman, but his madness was of a most uncommon and picturesque variety. It seemed significant that he should have chosen me for a confidant. All others who met him found him uncommunicative and taciturn to an extreme degree. I suppose he had felt the ordinary human need of unburdening himself to someone, and had selected me as the only person in the neighborhood who was potentially sympathetic. I saw him several times during the month that followed. He was indeed a strange psychological study, and I encouraged him to talk without reserve, though such encouragement was hardly necessary. There was much that he told me, a strange medley of the scientific and the mystic. I assented tactfully to all that he said, but ventured to point out the possible dangers of his evocative experiments, if they should prove successful. To this, with the fervor of an alchemist or a religious devotee, he replied that it did not matter, that he was prepared to accept any and all consequences. More than once he gave me to understand that his invention was progressing favorably, and one day he said with abruptness, "I will show you my mechanism if you care to see it." I protested my eagerness to view the invention, and he led me forthwith into a room to which I had not been admitted before. The chamber was large, triangular in form, and tapestried with curtains of some sullen black fabric. It had no windows. Clearly the internal structure of the house had been changed in making it, and all the queer village tales emanating from carpenters who had been hired to do the work were now explained. Exactly in the center of the room, there stood on a low tripod of brass, the apparatus of which Avaro had so often spoken. The contrivance was quite fantastic, and presented the appearance of some new, highly complicated musical instrument. I remembered that there were many wires of varying thickness, stretched on a series of concave sounding boards of some dark, unlustrous metal, and above these there depended from 3 horizontal bars a number of square, circular, and triangular gongs. Each of these appeared to be made of a different material. Some were bright as gold, or translucent as jade. Others were black and opaque as jet. A small hammer-like instrument hung opposite each gong, at the end of a silver wire. Avaro proceeded to expound the scientific basis of his mechanism. The vibrational properties of the gongs, he said, were designed to neutralize with their sound pitch all other cosmic vibrations than those of evil. He dwelt at much length on this extravagant theorem, developing it in a fashion oddly lucid. He ended his peroration. "I need one more gong to complete the instrument, and this I hope to invent very soon. The triangular room, draped in black and without windows, forms the ideal setting for my experiment. Apart from this room, I have not ventured to make any change in the house or its grounds. for fear of deranging some propitious element or collocation of elements. More than ever I thought he was mad, and though he had professed on many occasions to abhor the evil which he planned to evoke, I felt an inverted fanaticism in his attitude. In a less scientific age he would have been a devil worshipper, a partaker in the abominations of the Black Mass, or would have given himself to the study and practice of sorcery. His was a religious soul that had failed to find good in the scheme of things, and lacking it, was impelled to make of evil itself an object of secret reverence. "I fear that you think me insane," he observed in a sudden flash of clairvoyance. "Would you like to watch an experiment? Even though my invention is not completed, I may be able to convince you that my design is not altogether the fantasy of a disordered brain." I consented. He turned on the lights in the dim room. Then he went to an angle of the wall and pressed a hidden spring or switch. The wires on which the tiny hammers were strung began to oscillate, till each of the hammers touched lightly its companion gong. The sound they made was dissonant and disquieting to the last degree, a diabolic percussion unlike anything I have ever heard, and exquisitely painful to the nerves. I felt as if a flood of finely broken glass was pouring into my ears. The swinging of the hammers grew swifter and heavier, but to my surprise there was no corresponding increase of loudness in the sound. On the contrary, the clangor became slowly muted, till it was no more than an undertone which seemed to be coming from an immense depth or distance, an undertone still full of disquietude and torment, like the sobbing of far-off winds in hell, or the murmur of demonian fires on coasts of eternal ice. Said Avaro at my elbow, "To a certain extent, the combined notes of the gongs are beyond human hearing in their pitch. With the addition of the final gong, even less sound will be audible." While I was trying to digest this difficult idea, I noticed a partial dimming of the light above the tripod and its weird apparatus. A vertical shaft of faint shadow, surrounded by a still fainter penumbra, was forming in the air. The tripod itself and the wires, gongs, and hammers were now a trifle indistinct, as if seen through some obscuring veil. The center shaft and its penumbra seemed to widen, and looking down at the flood, where the outer adumbration conforming to the room's outline crept toward the walls, I saw that Avaro and myself were now within its ghostly triangle. At the same time there surged upon me an intolerable depression, together with a multitude of sensations which I despair of conveying in language. My very sense of space was distorted and deformed as if some unknown dimension had somehow been mingled with those familiar to us. There was a feeling of dreadful and measureless descent, as if the floor were sinking beneath me into some nether pit, and I seemed to pass beyond the room in a torrent of swirling, hallucinative images, visible but invisible, felt but intangible, and more awful, more accursed than that hurricane of lost souls beheld by Dante. Down, down I appeared to go, in the bottomless and phantom hell that was impinging upon reality. Death, decay, malignity, madness gathered in the air and pressed me down like satanic incubi in that ecstatic horror of descent. I felt that there were 1,000 forms, 1,000 faces about me, summoned from the gulfs of perdition, and yet I saw nothing but the white face of Avaro, stamped with a frozen and abominable rapture as he fell beside me. Like a dreamer who forces himself to awaken, he began to move away from me. I seemed to lose sight of him for a moment in the cloud of nameless, immaterial horrors that threatened to take on the further horror of substance. Then I realized that Avaro had turned off the switch, and that the oscillating hammers had ceased to beat on those infernal gongs. The double shaft of shadow faded in midair, the burden of terror and despair lifted from my nerves, and I no longer felt the damnable hallucination of nether space and descent. "My God!" I cried. "What was it?" Avaro's look was full of a ghastly, gloating exultation as he turned to me. "You saw and felt it then?" he queried. "That vague, imperfect manifestation of the perfect evil which exists somewhere in the cosmos. I shall yet call it forth in its entirety, and know the black, infinite reverse raptures which attend its epiphany." I recoiled from him with an involuntary shudder. All the hideous things that had swarmed upon me beneath the cacophonous beating of those accursed gongs drew near again for an instant, and I looked with fearful vertigo into hells of perversity and corruption. I saw an inverted soul, despairing of good, which longed for the baleful ecstasies of perdition. No longer did I think him merely mad, for I knew the thing which he sought and could attain, and I remembered with a new significance the line of Baudelaire's poem, "The hell wherein my heart delights." Avro was unaware of my revulsion in his dark rhapsody. When I turned to leave, unable to bear any longer the blasphemous atmosphere of that room and the sense of strange depravity which emanated from its owner, he pressed me to return as soon as possible. "I think," he exulted, "that all will be in readiness before long. I want you to be present in the hour of my triumph." I do not know what I said, nor what excuses I made to get away from him. I longed to assure myself that a world of unblasted sunlight and undefiled air could still exist. I went out, but a shadow followed me, and execrable faces leered or mowed from the foliage as I left the cypress-shaded grounds. For days afterward I was in a condition verging upon neurotic disorder. No one could come as close as I had been to the primal effluence of evil, and go thence unaffected. Shadowy, noisome cobwebs draped themselves on all my thoughts, and presences of unlineamented fear, of shapeless horror crouched in the half-lit corners of my mind, but would never fully declare themselves. An invisible gulf, bottomless as Malbolge, seemed to yawn before me wherever I went. Presently, though, my reason reasserted itself, and I wondered if my sensations in the black triangular room had not been wholly a matter of suggestion or auto-hypnosis. I asked myself if it were credible that a cosmic force of the sort postulated by Avro could really exist, or granting it existed, could be evoked by any man through the absurd intermediation of a musical device. The nervous terrors of my experience faded a little in memory, and though a disturbing doubt still lingered, I assured myself that all I had felt was of purely subjective origin. Even then it was with supreme reluctance, with an inward shrinking only to be overcome by violent resolve, that I returned to visit Avro once more. For an even longer period than usual, no one answered my knock. Then there were hurrying footsteps, and the door was opened abruptly by Fifine. I knew immediately that something was amiss, for her face wore a look of unnatural dread and anxiety, and her eyes were wide, with the white showing blankly as if she gazed upon horrific things. She tried to speak and made that ghastly, inarticulate sound which the mute is able to make on occasion, as she plucked my sleeve and drew me after her along the somber hall to the triangular room. The door was open, and as I approached it I heard a low, dissonant, snarling murmur, which I recognized as the sound of the gongs. It was like the voice of all the souls in a frozen hell, uttered by lips congealing slowly toward the ultimate torture of silence. It sank and sank till it seemed to be issuing from pits below the nadir. Fifine shrank back on the threshold, imploring me with a pitiful glance to precede her. The lights were all turned on, and Avro, clad in a strange medieval costume, in a black gown and cap such as Faustus might have worn, stood near the percussive mechanism. The hammers were all beating with a frenzied rapidity, and the sound became still lower and tenser as I approached. Avro did not seem to see me. His eyes, abnormally dilated and flaming with infernal luster like those of one possessed, were fixed upon something in midair. Again the soul-congealing hideousness, the sense of eternal falling, of myriad harpy-like incumbent horrors, rushed upon me as I looked and saw. Vaster and stronger than before, a double column of triangular shadow had materialized and was becoming more and more distinct. It swelled, it darkened, it enveloped the gong apparatus and towered to the ceiling. The double column grew solid and opaque as ebony, and the face of Avro, who was standing well within the broad penumbral shadow, became dim as if seen through a film of Stygian water. I must have gone utterly mad for a while. I remembered only a teeming delirium of things too frightful to be endured by a sane mind, that peopled the infinite gulf of hell-born illusion into which I sank with the hopeless precipitancy of the damned. There was a sickness inexpressible, a vertigo of redeemless descent, a pandemonium of ghoulish phantoms that reeled and swayed about the column of malign, omnipotent force which presided over all. Avro was only one more phantom in this delirium, when with arms outstretched in his perverse adoration, he stepped toward the inner column and passed into it till he was lost to view. And Fifine was another phantom when she ran by me to the wall and turned off the switch that operated those demoniacal hammers. As one who reemerges from a swoon, I saw the fading of the dual pillar till the light was no longer sullied by any tinge of that satanic radiation, and where it had been, Avro still stood beside the baleful instrument he had designed. Erect and rigid he stood, in a strange immobility, and I felt an incredulous horror, a chill awe, as I went forward and touched him with a faltering hand. For that which I saw and touched was no longer a human being, but an even statue, whose face and brow and fingers were black as the frost-like raiment or the sullen curtains. Charred as by sable fire, or frozen by black cold, the features bore the eternal ecstasy and pain of Lucifer in his ultimate hell of ice. For an instant, the supreme evil which Avaro had worshipped so madly, which he had summoned from the vaults of incalculable space, had made him one with itself, and passing, it had left him petrified into an image of its own essence. The form that I touched was harder than marble, and I knew that it would endure to all time as a testimony of the infinite Medusian power that is death and corruption and darkness. Fifine had now thrown herself at the feet of the image and was clasping its insensible knees. With her frightful muted moaning in my ears, I went forth for the last time from that chamber and from that mansion. Vainly, through delirious months and madness-ridden years, I have tried to shake off the infrangible obsession of my memories. But there is a fatal numbness in my brain, as if it too had been charred and blackened a little, in that moment of overpowering nearness to the dark ray of the black statue that was Jean Avaro. The impress of awful and forbidden things has been set like an everlasting seal.
The Chain of Aforgomon by Clark Ashton Smith. It is indeed strange that John Millwarp and his writing should have fallen so speedily into semi-oblivion. His books treating of Oriental life in a somewhat flowery, romantic style were popular a few months ago. But now, in spite of their range and penetration, their pervasive verbal sorcery, they are seldom mentioned, and they seem to have vanished unaccountably from the shelves of bookstores and libraries. Even the mystery of Millwarp's death, baffling to both law and science, has evoked but a passing interest, an excitement quickly lulled and forgotten. I am well acquainted with Millwarp over a term of years, but my recollection of the man is becoming strangely blurred, like an image in a misted mirror. His dark, half-alien personality, his preoccupation with the occult, his immense knowledge of Eastern life and lore, are things I remember with such effort and vagueness as attends the recovery of a dream. Sometimes I almost doubt that he ever existed. It is as if the man, and all that pertains to him, were being erased from human record by some mysterious acceleration of the common process of obliteration. In his will, he appointed me his executor. I have vainly tried to interest publishers in the novel he left among his papers, a novel surely not inferior to anything he ever wrote. They say that his vogue has passed. Now I am publishing as a magazine story the contents of the diary kept by Millwarp for a period preceding his demise. Perhaps for the open-minded, this diary will explain the enigma of his death. It would seem that the circumstances of that death are virtually forgotten, and I repeat them here as part of my endeavor to revive and perpetuate Millwarp's memory. Millwarp had returned to his house in San Francisco after a long sojourn in Indochina. We who knew him gathered that he had gone into places seldom visited by Occidentals. At the time of his demise, he was just finished correcting the typescript of a novel, which dealt with the more romantic and mysterious aspects of Burma. On the morning of April 2nd, 1933, his housekeeper, a middle-aged woman, was startled by a glare of brilliant light which issued from the half-open door of Millwarp's study. It was as if the whole room were in flames. Horrified, the woman hastened to investigate. Entering the study, she saw her master sitting in an armchair at the table, wearing the rich, somber robes of Chinese brocade, which he affected as a dressing gown. He sat stiffly erect, a pen clutched unmoving in his fingers on the open pages of a manuscript volume. About him in a sort of nimbus glowed and flickered the strange light, and her only thought was that his garments were on fire. She ran toward him, crying out a warning. At that moment the weird nimbus brightened intolerably, and the wan early day shine, the electric bulbs that still burned to attest the night's labor, were alike blotted out. It seemed to the housekeeper that something had gone wrong with the room itself, for the walls and table vanished, and a great luminous gulf opened before her, and on the verge of the gulf, in a seat that was not his cushioned armchair but a huge and rough-hewn seat of stone, she beheld her master stark and rigid. His heavy brocaded robes were gone, and about him from head to foot were blinding coils of pure white fire, in the form of linked chains. She could not endure the brilliance of the chains, and cowering back she shielded her eyes with her hands. When she dared look again, the weird glowing had faded. The room was as usual. and Millwarp's motionless figure was seated at the table in the posture of writing. Shaken and terrified as she was, the woman found courage to approach her master. A hideous smell of burnt flesh arose from beneath his garments, which were wholly intact and without visible trace of fire. He was dead, his fingers clenched on the pen, and his features frozen in a stare of titanic agony. His neck and wrists were completely encircled by frightful burns that had charred them deeply. The coroner, in his examination, found that these burns, preserving an outline as of heavy links, were extended in long, unbroken spirals around the arms and legs and torso. The burning was apparently the cause of Millwarp's death. It was as if iron chains heated to incandescence had been wrapped about him. Small credit was given to the housekeeper's story of what she had seen. No one, however, could suggest an acceptable explanation of the bizarre mystery. There was at the time much aimless discussion, but as I have hinted, people soon turned to other matters. The efforts made to solve the riddle were somewhat perfunctory. Chemists tried to determine the nature of a queer drug in the form of a gray powder with pearly granules, to whose use Millwarp had become addicted, but their tests merely revealed the presence of an alkaloid whose source and attributes were obscure to Western science. Day by day, the whole incredible business lapsed from public attention, and those who had known Millwarp began to display the forgetfulness that was no less unaccountable than his weird doom. The housekeeper, who had held steadfastly in the beginning to her story, came at length to share the common dubiety. Her account, with repetition, became vague and contradictory. Detail by detail, she seemed to forget the abnormal circumstances that she had witnessed with overwhelming horror. The manuscript volume in which Millwarp had apparently been writing at the time of death was given into my charge with his other papers. It proved to be a diary, its last entry breaking off abruptly. Since reading the diary, I have hastened to transcribe it in my own hand, because for some mysterious reason, the ink of the original is already fading and has become almost illegible in places. The reader will note certain lacunae due to passages written in an alphabet which neither I nor any scholar of my acquaintance can transliterate. These passages seem to form an integral part of the narrative, and they occur mainly toward the end, as if the writer had turned more and more to a language remembered from his ancient avatar. To the same mental reversion one must attribute the singular dating in which Millwarp, still employing English script, appears to pass from our contemporary notation to that of some pre-mundane world. I give hereunder the entire diary, which begins with an undated footnote. This book, unless I have been misinformed concerning the qualities of the drug Suvara, will be the record of my former life in a lost cycle. I have had the drug in my possession for 7 months, but fear has prevented me from using it. Now, by certain tokens, I perceive that the longing for knowledge will soon overcome the fear. Ever since my earliest childhood, I have been troubled by intimations, dim, unplaceable, that seem to argue a forgotten existence. These intimations partook of the nature of feelings rather than ideas or images. They were like the wraiths of dead memories. In the background of my mind, there has lurked a sentiment of formless, melancholy desire for some nameless beauty long perished out of time. And coincidentally, I have been haunted by an equally formless dread, an apprehension as of some bygone but still imminent doom. Such feelings have persisted undiminished throughout my youth and maturity, but nowhere have I found any clue to their causation. My travels in the mystic Orient, my delvings into occultism have merely convinced me that these shadowy intuitions pertain to some incarnation buried under the wreck of remotest cycles. Many times in my wanderings through Buddhistic lands, I had heard of the drug Suvara, which is believed to restore, even for the uninitiate, the memory of other lives. And at last, after many vain efforts, I managed to procure a supply of the drug. The manner in which I obtained it is a tale sufficiently remarkable in itself, but of no special relevance here. So far, perhaps because of that apprehension which I have hinted, I have not dared to use the drug. March 9th, 1933. This morning I took Suvara for the first time, dissolving the proper amount in pure distilled water as I had been instructed to do. Afterward I leaned back easily in my chair, breathing with a slow, regular rhythm. I had no preconceived idea of the sensations that would mark the drug's initial effect, since these were said to vary prodigiously with the temperament of the users. But I composed myself to await them with tranquility, after formulating clearly in my mind the purpose of the experiment. For a while there was no change in my awareness. I noticed a slight quickening of the pulse, and modulated my breathing in conformity with this. Then by slow degrees, I experienced a sharpening of visual perception. The Chinese rugs on the floor, the backs of the serried volumes on my bookcases, the very wood of the chairs, table, and shelves began to exhibit new and unimagined colors. At the same time, there were curious alterations of outline, every object seeming to extend itself in a hitherto unsuspected fashion. Following this, my surroundings became semi-transparent, like molded shapes of mist. I found that I could see through the marbled cover the illustrations in a volume of John Martin's edition of Paradise Lost, which lay before me on the table. All this I knew was a mere extension of ordinary physical vision. It was only a prelude to those apperceptions of occult realms which I sought through Suvara. Fixing my mind once more on the goal of the experiment, I became aware that the misty walls had vanished like a drawn arras. About me, like reflections in rippled water, dim sceneries wavered and shifted, erasing one another from instant to instant. I seemed to hear a vague but ever-present sound, more musical than the murmurs of air, water, or fire, which was a property of the unknown element that environed me. With a sense of troublous familiarity, I beheld the blurred, unstable pictures which flowed past me upon this never-resting medium. Orient temples, flashing with sun-struck bronze and gold, the sharp, crowded gables and spires of medieval cities, tropic and northern forests, the costumes and physiognomies of the Levant, of Persia, of old Rome and Carthage, went by like blown, flying mirages. Each succeeding tableau belonged to a more ancient period than the one before it, and I knew that each was a scene from some former existence of my own. Still tethered, as it were, to my present self, I reviewed these visible memories which took on tri-dimensional depth and clarity. I saw myself as warrior and troubadour, as noble and merchant and mendicant. I trembled with dead fears. I thrilled with lost hopes and raptures, and was drawn by ties that death and Lethe had broken. Yet never did I fully identify myself with those other avatars, for I knew well that the memory I sought pertained to some incarnation of older epochs. Still the phantasmagoria streamed on, and I turned giddy with vertigo, ineffable before the vastness and diurtony of the cycles of being. It seemed that I, the watcher, was lost in a gray land, where the homeless ghosts of all dead ages went fleeing from oblivion to oblivion. The walls of Nineveh, the columns and towers of unnamed cities rose before me and were swept away. I saw the luxuriant plains that are now the Gobi Desert. The sea-lost capitals of Atlantis were drawn to the light in unquenched glory. I gazed on lush and cloudy scenes from the first continents of Earth. Briefly, I relived the beginnings of terrestrial man, and knew that the secret I would learn was ancienter even than these. My visions faded into black voidness, and yet in that void, through fathomless eons, it seemed that I existed still like a blind atom in the space between the worlds. About me was the darkness and repose of that night, which antedated the earth's creation. Time flowed backward with the silence of dreamless sleep. The illumination, when it came, was instant and complete. I stood in the full, fervid blaze of day amid royally towering blossoms in a deep garden, beyond whose lofty, vine-clad walls I heard the confused murmuring of the great city called Kalud. Above me at their vernal zenith were the 4 small suns that illumined the planet Heston. Jewel-colored insects fluttered about me, lighting without fear on the rich habiliments of gold and black, and wrought with astronomic symbols in which I was attired. Beside me was a dial-shaped altar of zoned agate, carved with the same symbols, which were those of the dreadful omnipotent time god, Aforgomon, whom I served as a priest. I had not even the slightest memory of myself as John Millwarp, and the long pageant of my terrestrial lives was as something that had never been, or was yet to be. Sorrow and desolation choked my heart as ashes fill some urn consecrated to the dead, and all the hues and perfumes of the garden about me were redolent only of the bitterness of death. Gazing darkly upon the altar, I muttered blasphemy against Aforgomon, who in his inexorable course had taken away my beloved and had sent no solace for my grief. Separately I cursed the signs upon the altar, the stars, the worlds, the suns, the moons, that meted and fulfilled the processes of time. Belthoris, my betrothed, had died at the end of the previous autumn, and so with double maledictions, I cursed the stars and planets presiding over that season. I became aware that a shadow had fallen beside my own on the altar, and knew that the dark sage and sorcerer, Atmox, had obeyed my summons. Fearfully, but not without hope, I turned toward him, noting first of all that he bore under his arm a heavy, sinister-looking volume, with covers of black steel and hasps of adamant. Only when I had made sure of this did I lift my eyes to his face, which was little less somber and forbidding than the tome he carried. "Greetings, O Calaspa," he said harshly. "I have come against my own will and judgment. The lore that you request is in this volume, and since you saved me in former years from the inquisitorial wrath of the Time God's priests, I cannot refuse to share it with you, but understand well that even I, who have called upon names that are dreadful to utter, and have evoked forbidden presences, shall never dare to assist you in this conjuration. Gladly would I help you to hold converse with the shadow of Belthoris, or to animate her still unwithered body and draw it forth from the tomb. But that which you propose is another matter. You alone must perform the ordained rites, must speak the necessary words, for the consequences of this thing will be direr than you deem." "I care not for consequences," I replied eagerly, "if it be possible to bring back the lost hours which I shared with Belthoris. Think you that I could content myself with her shadow, wandering thinly back from the borderland? Or that I could take pleasure in the fair clay that the breath of necromancy has troubled, and has made to arise and walk without mind or soul? Nay, the Belthoris I would summon is she on whom the shadow of death has never yet fallen." It seemed that Atmox, the master of doubtful arts, the vassal of umbrageous powers, recoiled and blenched before my vehement declaration. "Bethink you," he said with minatory sternness, "that this thing will constitute a breach of the sacred logic of time, and a blasphemy against Aforgomon, god of the minutes and the cycles? Moreover, there is little to be gained, for not in its entirety may you bring back the season of your love, but only one single hour, torn with infinite violence from its rightful period in time. Refrain, I adjure you, and content yourself with a lesser sorcery." "Give me the book," I demanded. "My service to Aforgomon is forfeit, with due reverence and devotion. I have worshipped the Time God, and have done in his honor the rites ordained from eternity, and for all this the god has betrayed me." Then in that high-climbing, luxuriant garden beneath the four suns, Atmox opened the adamantine clasps of the steel-bound volume, and turning to a certain page, he laid the book reluctantly in my hands. The page, like its fellows, was of some unholy parchment streaked with musty discolorations, and blackening at the margin with sheer antiquity. But upon it shone unquenchably the dread characters a primal age had written with an ink bright as the new-shed ichor of demons. Above this page I bent in my madness, conning it over and over till I was dazzled by the fiery runes, and shutting my eyes I saw them burn on a red darkness, still legible and writhing like hellish worms. Hollowly, like the sound of a far bell, I heard the voice of Atmox. "You have learned, O Calaspa, the unutterable name of that one whose assistance can alone restore the fled hours, and you have learned the incantation that will rouse that hidden power, and the sacrifice needed for its propitiation. Knowing these things, is your heart still strong and your purpose firm?" The name I had read in that wizard volume was that of the chief cosmic power, antagonistic to Aforgomon. The incantation and the required offering were those of a foul demonolatry. Nevertheless, I did not hesitate, but gave resolute, affirmative answer to the somber query of Atmox. Perceiving that I was inflexible, he bowed his head, trying no more to dissuade me. Then, as the flame-ruined volume had bade me do, I defiled the altar of Aforgomon, blotting certain of its prime symbols with dust and spittle. While Atmox looked on in silence, I wounded my right arm to its deepest vein on the sharp-tipped gnomon of the dial, and letting the blood drip from zone to zone, from orb to orb, on the graven agate, I made unlawful sacrifice, and intoned aloud in the name of the lurking chaos, Zizanoth, an abominable ritual composed by a backward repetition and jumbling of litanies sacred to the Time God. Even as I chanted the incantation, it seemed that webs of shadow were woven foully athwart the suns, and the ground shook a little, as if colossal demons trod the world's rim, striding stupendously from abysses beyond. The garden walls and trees wavered like a wind-blown reflection in a pool, and I grew faint with the loss of that lifeblood I had poured out in demonolatrous offering. Then in my flesh and in my brain I felt the intolerable racking of a vibration like the long-drawn shock of cities riven by earthquake, and coasts crumbling before some chaotic sea.
and my flesh was torn and harrowed, and my brain shuddered with the toneless discords sweeping through me from deep to deep. I faltered, and confusion gnawed at my inmost being. Dimly I heard the prompting of Atmox, and dimmer still was the sound of my own voice that made answer to Zizanoth, naming the impious necromancy, which was to be effected only through its power. Madly I implored from Zizanoth, in despite of time and its ordered seasons, 1 hour of that bygone autumn which I had shared with Belthoris, and imploring this, I named no special hour, for all in memory had seemed of an equal joy and gladness. As the words ceased upon my lips, I thought that darkness fluttered in the air like a great wing, and the 4 suns went out, and my heart was stilled as if in death. Then the light returned, falling obliquely from suns mellow with full-tided autumn, and nowhere beside me was there any shadow of Atmox, and the altar of zoned agate was bloodless and undefiled. I, the lover of Belthoris, witting naught of the doom and sorrow to come, stood happily with my beloved before the altar, and saw her young hands crown its ancient dial with the flowers we had plucked from the garden. Dreadful beyond all fathoming are the mysteries of time. Even I, the priest and initiate, though wise in the secret doctrines of Aforgomon, know little enough of that elusive, ineluctable process whereby the present becomes the past, and the future resolves itself into the present. All men have pondered riddles of duration and transience, have wondered vainly to what bourne the lost days and the sped cycles are consigned. Some have dreamt that the past abides unchanged, becoming eternity as it slips from our mortal ken, and others have deemed that time is a stairway whose steps crumble one by one behind the climber, falling into a gulf of nothing. Howsoever this may be, I know that she who stood beside me was the Belthoris on whom no shadow of mortality had yet descended. The hour was one newborn in a golden season, and the minutes to come were pregnant with all wonder and surprise belonging to the untried future. Taller was my beloved than the frail, unbowed lilies of the garden. In her eyes was the sapphire of moonless evenings sown with small golden stars. Her lips were strangely curved, but only blitheness and joy had gone to their shaping. She and I had been betrothed from our childhood, and the time of the marriage rites was now approaching. Our intercourse was wholly free, according to the custom of that world. Often she came to walk with me in my garden, and to decorate the altar of that god whose resolving moons and suns would soon bring the season of our felicity. The moths that flew about us winged with aerial cloth of gold were no lighter than our hearts. Making blithe holiday, we fanned our frolic mood to a high flame of rapture. We were akin to the full-hued climbing flowers, the swift darting insects, and our spirits blended and soared with the perfumes that were drawn skyward in the warm air. Unheard by us was the loud murmuring of the mighty city of Khulud, lying beyond my garden walls. For us, the many-peopled planet known as Heston no longer existed, and we dwelt alone in a universe of light, in a blossomed heaven. Exalted by love in the high harmony of those moments, we seemed to touch eternity, and even I, the priest of Aforgomon, forgot the blossom-fretting days, the system-devouring cycles. In the sublime folly of passion, I swore then that death or discord could never mar the perfect communion of our hearts. After we had wreathed the altar, I sought the rarest, the most delectable flowers, frail curving cups of wine-washed pearl, of moony azure, and white with scrolled purple lips, and these I twined between kisses and laughter, in the blaze maze of Belthoris's hair, saying that another shrine than that of time should receive its due offering. Tenderly, with a lover's delay, I lingered over the wreathing, and ere I had finished there fluttered to the ground beside us a great crimson-spotted moth whose wing had somehow been broken in its airy voyaging through the garden. And Belthoris, ever tender of heart and pitiful, turned from me and took up the moth in her hands, and some of the bright blossoms dropped from her hair unheeded. Tears welled from her deep blue eyes, and seeing that the moth was sorely hurt and would never fly again, she refused to be comforted. And no longer would she respond to my passionate wooing. I, who grieved less for the moth than she, was somewhat vexed, and between her sadness and my vexation, there grew between us some tiny, temporary rift. Then, ere love had ended the misunderstanding, then while we stood before the dread altar of time with sundered hands, with eyes averted from each other, it seemed that a shroud of darkness descended upon the garden. I heard the crash and crumbling of shattered worlds, and a black flowing of ruinous things that went past me through the darkness. The dead leaves of winter were blown about me, and there was a falling of tears or rain. Then the vernal suns came back, high-stationed in cruel splendor, and with them came the knowledge of all that had been, of Belthoris's death, and my sorrow, and the madness that had led to forbidden sorcery. Vain now, like all other hours, was the resummoned hour, and doubly irredeemable was my loss. My blood dripped heavily on the dishallowed altar, my faintness grew deathly, and I saw through murky mist the face of Atmox beside me, and the face was like that of some comminatory demon. March 13th. I, John Millwarp, write this date and my name with an odd dubiety. My visionary experience under the drug Suvara ended with that rilling of my blood on the symbol dial, that glimpse of the terror-distorted face of Atmox. All this was in another world, in a life removed from the present, by births and deaths without number. And yet it seems not wholly have I returned from the twice-ancient past. Memories, broken but strangely vivid and living, press upon me from the existence of which my vision was a fragment, and portions of the lore of Heston, and scraps of its history and words from its lost language, arise unbidden in my mind. Above all, my heart is still shadowed by the sorry of Calaspa, his desperate necromancy, which would seem to others no more than a dream within a dream, is stamped as with fire on the black pages of recollection. I know the awfulness of the god he had blasphemed, and the foulness of the demonolatry he had done, and the sense of guilt and despair under which he swooned. It is this that I have striven all my life to remember, this which I have been doomed to re-experience. And I fear, with a great fear, the further knowledge which a second experiment with the drug will reveal to me. The next entry of Millwarp's diary begins with a strange dating in English script, the second day of the moon, Occult, in the 1009th year of the Red Aeon. This dating perhaps is repeated in the language of Heston, for directly beneath it, a line of unknown ciphers is set apart. Several lines of the subsequent text are in the alien tongue, and then, as if by an unconscious reversion, Millwarp continues the diary in English. There is no reference to another experiment with Suvara, but apparently such had been made, with a continued revival of his lost memories. What genius of the Nadir Gulf had tempted me to this thing, and had caused me to overlook the consequences? Verily, when I called up for myself in Belthoris an hour of former autumn, with all that was attendant upon the hour, that bygone interim was likewise evoked and repeated for the whole world Heston, and the four sons of Heston. From the full midst of spring all men had stepped backward into autumn, keeping only the memory of things prior to the hour thus resurrected, and knowing not the events future to the hour. But returning to the present, they recalled with amazement the unnatural necromancy, and fear and bewilderment were upon them, and none could interpret the meaning. For a brief period the dead had lived again, the fallen leaves had returned to the bough, the heavenly bodies had stood at a long abandoned station, the flower had gone back into the seed, the plant into the root. Then, with eternal disorder set among all its cycles, time had resumed its delayed course. No movement of any cosmic body, no year or instant of the future would be precisely as it should have been. The error and discrepancy I had wrought would bear fruit in ways innumerable. The suns would find themselves at fault, the worlds and atoms would go always a little astray from their appointed bournes. It was of these matters that Atmox spoke, warning me after he had staunched my bleeding wound, for he too in that relumed hour had gone back and had lived again through a past happening. For him, the hour was one in which he had descended into the nether vaults of his house. There, standing in a many-pentacled circle, with burning of unholy incense and uttering of accursed formula, he had called upon a malign spirit from the bowels of Heston, and had questioned it concerning the future. But the spirit, black and voluminous as the fumes of pitch, refused to answer him directly, and pressed furiously with its clawed members against the confines of the circle. It said only, "Thou hast summoned me at thy peril. Potent are the spells thou hast used, and strong is the circle to withstand me, and I am restrained by time and space from the wreaking of my anger upon thee. But haply thou shalt summon me again, albeit in the same hour of the same autumn, and in that summoning the laws of time shall be broken, and a rift shall be made in space, and through the rift, though with some delay and divagation, I will yet win to thee." Saying no more, it prowled restlessly about the circle, and its eyes burned down upon Atmox like embers in a high-lifted sooty brazier, and ever and anon its fanged mouth was flattened on the spell-deafened air, and in the end he could dismiss it only after a double repetition of the form of exorcism.
As he told me this tale in the garden, Atmox trembled, and his eyes searched the narrow shadows wrought by the high suns, and he seemed to listen for the noise of some evil thing that burrowed toward him beneath the earth. 4th day of the moon, Occult. Stricken with terrors beyond those of Atmox, I kept apart in my mansion amid the city of Kalud. I was still weak with the loss of blood I had yielded to Zizanoth. My senses were full of strange shadows. My servitors coming and going about me were as phantoms, and scarcely I heeded the pale fear in their eyes, or heard the dreadful things they whispered. Madness and chaos, they told me, were abroad in Kalud. The divinity of Aforgomon was angered. All men thought that some baleful doom impended because of that unnatural confusion which had been wrought among the hours of time. This afternoon they brought me the story of Atmox's death. In bated tones they told me how his neophytes had heard a roaring as of a loose tempest in the chamber where he sat alone with his wizard volumes and paraphernalia. Above the roaring for a little, human screams had sounded, together with a dashing as of hurled censers and braziers, a crashing as of overthrown tables and tomes. Blood rilled from under the shut door of the chamber, and rilling, it took from instant to instant the form of dire ciphers that spelt an unspeakable name. After the noises had ceased, the neophytes waited a long while ere they dared open the door. Entering at last, they saw the floor and the walls heavily bespattered with blood, and rags of the sorcerer's raiment mingled everywhere with the sheets of his torn volumes of magic, and the shreds and manglings of his flesh strewn amid broken furniture, and his brains daubed in a horrible paste on the high ceiling. Hearing this tale, I knew that the earthly demon feared by Atmox had found him somehow, and had wreaked its wrath upon him. In ways unguessable, it had reached him through the chasm made in ordered time and space by 1 hour repeated through necromancy. And because of that lawless chasm, the magician's power and lore had utterly failed to defend him from the demon. 5th day of the moon, Occult. Atmox, I am sure, had not betrayed me, for in so doing he must have betrayed his own implicit share in my crime. Howbeit, this evening the priest came to my house ere the setting of the westernmost sun. Silent, grim, with eyes averted as if from a foulness innominable. Me, their fellow, they enjoined with loth gestures to accompany them. Thus they took me from my house and along the thoroughfares of Kalud toward the lowering suns. The streets were empty of all other passers, and it seemed that no man desired to meet or behold the blasphemer. Down the avenue of gnomon-shaped pillars, I was led to the portals of Aforgomon's fane, those awfully gaping portals arched in the likeness of some devouring chimera's mouth. 6th day of the moon, Occult. They had thrust me into an oblate beneath the temple, dark, noisome, and soundless, except for the maddening, measured drip of water beside me. There I lay and knew not when the nights passed and the morning came. Light was admitted only when my captors opened the iron door, coming to lead me before the tribunal. Thus the priests condemned me, speaking with one voice in whose dreadful volume the tones of all were indistinguishably blended. Then the aged high priest, Helpenor, called aloud upon Aforgomon, offering himself as a mouthpiece to the god, and asking the god to pronounce through him the doom that was adequate for such enormities of those of which I had been judged guilty by my fellows. Instantly, it seemed, the god descended into Helpenor, and the figure of the high priest appeared to dilate prodigiously beneath his mufflings, and the accents that issued from his mouth were like thunders of the upper heaven. O Calaspa, thou hast set disorder amid all future hours and eons through this evil necromancy. Thereby, moreover, thou hast wrought thine own doom. Fettered art thou forever to the hour thus unlawfully repeated, apart from its due place in time. According to hieratic rule, thou shalt meet the death of the fiery chains. But deem not that this death is more than the symbol of thy true punishment. Thou shalt pass hereafter through other lives in Heston, and thou shalt climb midway in the cycles of the world subsequent to Heston in time and space. But through all thine incarnations the chaos thou hast invoked will attend thee, widening ever like a rift. And always in thy lives the rift will bar thee from reunion with the soul of Belthoris. And always, though merely by an hour, thou shalt miss the love that should otherwise have been oftentimes regained. At last, when the chasm is widened overmuch, thy soul shall fare no farther in the onward cycles of incarnation. At that time it shall be given thee to remember clearly thine ancient sin, and remembering,
thou shalt perish out of time. Upon the body of that latter life shall be found the charred imprint of the chains, as the final token of thy bondage. But they that knew thee will soon forget, and thou shalt belong wholly to the cycles limited for thee by thy sin. March 29th. I write this date with infinite desperation, trying to convince myself that there is a John Millwarp who exists on Earth in the 20th century. For 2 days running I have not taken the drug Suvara, and yet I have returned twice to that obelette of Aforgomon's temple, in which the priest Calaspa awaits his doom. Twice I have been immersed in its stagnant darkness, hearing the slow drip of water beside me, like a clepsydra that tells the black ages of the damned. Even as I write this at my library table, it seems that an ancient midnight plucks at the lamp. The bookcases turn to walls of oozing nighted stone. There is no longer a table, nor one who writes, and I breathe the noisome dankness of a dungeon lying unfathomed by any sun in a lost world. 18th day of the moon, Occult. Today, for the last time, they took me from my prison. Helpenor, together with 3 others, came and led me to the adytum of the god. Far beneath the outer temple we went, through spacious crypts unknown to the common worshippers. There was no word spoken, no glance exchanged between the others and me, and it seemed that they had already regarded me as one cast out from time and claimed by oblivion. We came ultimately to that sheer falling gulf in which the spirit of Aforgomon is said to dwell. Lights, feeble and far scattered, shone around it like stars on the rim of cosmic vastness, shedding no ray into the depths. There, in a seat of hewn stone overhanging the frightful verge, I was placed by the executioners, and a ponderous chain of black, unrusted metal, stapled to the solid rock, was wound about and about me, circling my naked body in separate limbs, from head to foot. To this doom others had been condemned for heresy or impiety, though never for a sin such as mine. After the chaining of the victim, he was left for a stated interim to ponder his crime, and haply to confront the dark divinity of Aforgomon. At length, from the abyss into which his position forced him to peer, a light would dawn, and a bolt of strange flame would leap upward, striking the many-coiled chain about him, and heating it instantly to the whiteness of incandescent iron. The source and nature of the flame were mysterious, and many ascribed it to the god himself rather than to mortal agency. Even thus they have left me, and have gone away. Long since the burden of the massy links cutting deeper and deeper into my flesh has become an agony. I am dizzy from gazing downward into the abyss, and yet I cannot fall. Beneath, immeasurably beneath, at recurrent intervals, I hear a hollow and solemn sound. Perhaps it is the sigh of sunken waters, of caverns straying winds, or the respiration of one that abides in the darkness, meeting with his breath the slow minutes, the hours, the days, the ages. My terror has become heavier than the chain. My vertigo is born of a twofold gulf. Eons have passed by and all the worlds have ebbed into nothingness, like wreckage borne on a chasm-falling stream, taking with them the lost face of Belthorus. I am poised above the gaping maw of the shadow. Somehow, in another world, an exile phantom has written these words, a phantom who must fade utterly from time and place, even as I, the doomed priest Calaspa. I cannot remember the name of the phantom. Beneath me in the black depths, there is an awful brightening. The House Among the Laurels, by William Hope Hodgson. This is a curious yarn that I am going to tell you, said Carnacki, as after a quiet little dinner we made ourselves comfortable in his cozy dining room. I have just got back from the west of Ireland, he continued. Wentworth, a friend of mine, has lately had rather an unexpected legacy, in the shape of a large estate and manor, about 1.5 miles outside the village of Corrington. This place is named Gannington Manor, and has been empty a great number of years, as you will find is almost always the case with houses reputed to be haunted, as it is usually termed. It seems that when Wentworth went over to take possession, he found the place in very poor repair, and the estate totally uncared for, and as I know, looking very desolate and lonesome generally. He went through the big house by himself, and he admitted to me that it had an uncomfortable feeling about it. But of course, that might be nothing more than the natural dismalness of a big, empty house, which has been long uninhabited, and through which you are wandering alone. When he had finished his look round, he went down to the village, meaning to see the one-time agent of the estate, and arrange for someone to go in as caretaker,
The agent, who proved by the way to be a Scotchman, was very willing to take up the management of the estate once more, but he assured Wentworth that they would get no one to go in as caretaker, and that his, the agent's advice, was to have the house pulled down and a new one built. This naturally astonished my friend, and as they went down to the village, he managed to get a sort of explanation from the man. It seems that there had been always curious stories told about the place, which in the early days was called Landrew Castle, and that within the last 7 years there had been 2 extraordinary deaths there. In each case they had been tramps who were ignorant of the reputation of the house, and had probably thought the big empty place suitable for a night's free lodging. There had been absolutely no signs of violence to indicate the method by which death was caused, and on each occasion the body had been found in the great entrance hall. By this time they had reached the inn where Wentworth had put up, and he told the agent that he would prove that it was all rubbish about the haunting by staying a night or 2 in the manor himself. The death of the tramps was certainly curious, but did not prove that any supernatural agency had been at work. They were but isolated accidents, spread over a large number of years by the memory of the villagers, which was natural enough in a little place like Corrington. Tramps had to die sometime, and in some place, and it proved nothing that 2, out of possibly hundreds who had slept in the empty house, had happened to take the opportunity to die under shelter. But the agent took his remark very seriously, and both he and Dennis, the landlord of the inn, tried their best to persuade him not to go. For his soul's sake, Irish Dennis begged him to do no such thing, and because of his life's sake, the Scotchman was equally in earnest. It was late afternoon at the time, and as Wentworth told me, it was warm and bright, and it seemed such utter rot to hear those 2 talking seriously about the impossible. He felt full of pluck, and he made up his mind he would smash the story of the haunting at once by staying that very night in the manor. He made this quite clear to them, and told them that it would be more to the point and to their credit if they offered to come up along with him and keep him company. But poor old Dennis was quite shocked, I believe, at the suggestion, and though Tabbitt, the agent, took it more quietly, he was very solemn about it. It seems that Wentworth did go, and though, as he said to me, when the evening began to come, it seemed a very different sort of thing to tackle. A whole crowd of the villagers assembled to see him off, for by this time they all knew of his intention. Wentworth had his gun with him, and a big packet of candles, and he made it clear to them all that it would not be wise for anyone to play any tricks, as he intended to shoot at sight. And then, you know, he got a hint of how serious they considered the whole thing, for one of them came up to him, leading a great bull mastiff, and offered it to him to take to keep him company. Wentworth patted his gun, but the old man who owned the dog shook his head and explained that the brute might warn him in sufficient time for him to get away from the castle, for it was obvious that he did not consider the gun would prove of any use. Wentworth took the dog and thanked the man. He told me that already he was beginning to wish that he had not said definitely that he would go, but as it was, he was simply forced to. He went through the crowd of men and found suddenly that they had all turned in a body and were keeping him company. They stayed with him all the way to the manor, and then went right over the whole place with him. It was still daylight when this was finished, though turning to dusk, and for a while the men stood about, hesitating, as if they felt ashamed to go away and leave Wentworth there all alone. He told me that by this time he would gladly have given £50 to be going back with them, and then abruptly an idea came to him. He suggested that they should stay with him and keep him company through the night. For a time they refused, and tried to persuade him to go back with them, but finally he made a proposition that got home to them all. He planned that they should all go back to the inn, and there get a couple of dozen bottles of whiskey, a donkey load of turf and wood, and some more candles. Then they would come back and make a great fire in the big fireplace, light all the candles, and put them round the place, open the whiskey, and make a night of it. And by Jove, he got them to agree. They set off back and were soon at the inn, and here, whilst the donkey was being loaded and the candles and whiskey distributed, Dennis was doing his best to keep Wentworth from going back, but he was a sensible man in his way, for when he found that it was no use, he stopped. You see, he did not want to frighten the others from accompanying Wentworth. "I'll tell ye, sir," he told him, "'tis of no use at all, thryin' to reclaim their castle. 'Tis cursed with innocent blood, and you'll be better pulling it down and building a new fine one. But if ye be intended to stay this night, keep the big door open wide and watch for the blood drip. If so much as a single drip falls, don't stay through all the gold in the world was offered ye."
Wentworth asked him what he meant by the blood drip. Sure, he said. 'Tis the blood of Thim, as old Black Mick way back in the old days kilt in their slape. 'Twas a feud as he pretended to patch up, and he invited them, the O'Haras they was, 70 of them, and he fed them, and spoke soft to them, and them trustin' him, stayed to slape with him. Then, he and them with him, started in and murdered them, wasn't all as they slept. 'Tis from thee father's grandfather ye have the story, and since then 'tis death to any, so they say, to pass the night in the castle with the blood drip comes. 'Twill put out candle and fire, and then in darkness the Virgin herself would be powerless to protect ye. Wentworth told me he laughed at this, chiefly because, as he put it, one always must laugh at that sort of yarn, however it makes you feel inside. He asked old Dennis whether he expected him to believe it. Yes, sir, said Dennis. I do mean to believe it, and please God, if you'll believe it, ye may be back safe before morning. The man's serious simplicity took hold of Wentworth, and he held out his hand. But for all that he went, and I must admire his pluck. There were now about 40 men, and when they got back to the manor, or castle as the villagers always call it, they were not long in getting a big fire going, and lighted candles all around the great hall. They had all brought sticks, so that they would have been a pretty formidable lot to tackle by anything simply physical, and of course Wentworth had his gun. He kept the whiskey in his own charge, for he intended to keep them sober, but he gave them a good strong tot all round first, so as to make things seem cheerful, and to get them yearning. If you once let a crowd of men like that grow silent, they begin to think, and then to fancy things. The big entrance door had been left wide open by his orders, which shows that he had taken some notice of Dennis. It was a quiet night, so this did not matter, for the lights kept steady, and all went on in a jolly sort of fashion for about 3 hours. He had opened a second lot of bottles, and everyone was feeling cheerful, so much so that one of the men called out aloud to the ghosts to come out and show themselves. And then, a very extraordinary thing happened, for the ponderous main door swung quietly, and steadily too, as though pushed by an invisible hand, and shut with a sharp click. Wentworth stared, feeling suddenly rather chilly. Then he remembered the men, and looked round at them. Several had ceased their talk, and were staring in a frightened way at the big door, but the great number had never noticed, and were talking and yarning. He reached for his gun, and the following instant the great bull mastiff set up a tremendous barking, which drew the attention of the whole company. The hall, I should tell you, is oblong. The south wall is all windows, but the north and east have rows of doors, leading into the house, whilst the west wall is occupied by the great entrance. The rows of doors leading into the house were all closed, and it was toward one of these in the north wall that the big dog ran. Yet he would not go very close, and suddenly the door began to move slowly open, until the blackness of the passage beyond was shown. The dog came back among the men, whimpering, and for a minute there was an absolute silence. Then Wentworth went out from the men a little, and aimed his gun at the doorway. "Whoever is there, come out or I shall fire," he shouted, but nothing came, and he blazed forth both barrels into the dark. As though the report had been a signal, all the doors along the north and east walls moved slowly open, and Wentworth and his men were staring, frightened into the black shapes of the empty doorways. Wentworth loaded his gun quickly and called to the dog, but the brute was burrowing away in among the men, and this fear on the dog's part frightened Wentworth more, he told me, than anything. Then something else happened. 3 of the candles over in the corner of the hall went out, and immediately about half a dozen in different parts of the place. More candles were put out, and the hall had become quite dark in the corners. The men were all standing now holding their clubs, and crowded together, and no one said a word. Wentworth told me he felt positively ill with fright. I know the feeling. Then suddenly something splashed on the back of his left hand. He lifted it and looked. It was covered with a great splash of red that dripped from his fingers. An old Irishman near him saw it and croaked out in a quivering voice, "The blood drip!" When the old man called out, they all looked, and in the same instant others felt it upon them. There were frightened cries of, "The blood drip! The blood drip!" And then about a dozen candles went out simultaneously, and the hall was suddenly dark. The dog let out a great mournful howl, and there was a horrible little silence, with everyone standing rigid. Then the tension broke, and there was a mad rush for the main door. They wrenched it open and tumbled out into the dark, but something slammed it with a crash after them and shut the dog in, for Wentworth heard it howling as they raced down the drive. yet no one had the pluck to go back to let it out, which does not surprise me. Wentworth sent for me the following day. He had heard of me in connection with that steeple monster case. I arrived by the night mail and put up with Wentworth at the inn. The next day we went up to the old manor, which certainly lies in a rather wilderness, though what struck me most was the extraordinary number of laurel bushes around the house. The place was smothered with them, so that the house seemed to be growing up out of a sea of green laurel. These and the grim ancient look of the old building made the place look a bit dank and ghostly, even by daylight. The hall was a big place, and well lit by daylight, for which I was not sorry. You see, I had been rather wound up by Wentworth's yarn. We found one rather funny thing, and that was the great bull mastiff lying stiff with its neck broken. This made me feel very serious, for it showed that whether the cause was supernatural or not, there was present in the house some force exceedingly dangerous to life. Later, whilst Wentworth stood guard with his shotgun, I made an examination of the hall. The bottles and mugs from which the men had drunk their whiskey were scattered about, and all over the place were the candles stuck upright in their own grease. But in the somewhat brief and general search, I found nothing, and decided to begin my usual exact examination of every square foot of the place, not only of the hall, in this case, but of the whole interior of the castle. I spent 3 uncomfortable weeks searching, but without result of any kind, and you know the care I take at this period is extreme, for I have solved hundreds of cases of so-called hauntings at this early stage, simply by the most minute investigation and the keeping of a perfectly open mind. But as I have said, I found nothing. During the whole of the examination, I got Wentworth to stand guard with his loaded shotgun, and I was very particular that we were never caught there after dusk. I decided now to make the experiment of staying a night in the great hall, of course protected. I spoke about it to Wentworth, but his own attempt had made him so nervous that he begged me to do no such thing. However, I thought it well worth the risk, and I managed in the end to persuade him to be present. With this in view, I went to the neighboring town of Gaunt, and by an arrangement with the chief constable, I obtained the services of 6 policemen with their rifles. The arrangement was unofficial, of course, and the men were allowed to volunteer with a promise of payment. When the constables arrived early that evening at the inn, I gave them a good feed, and after that we all set out for the manor. We had 4 donkeys with us, loaded with fuel and other matters, also 2 great boarhounds, which one of the police led. When we reached the house, I set the men to unload the donkeys, whilst Wentworth and I set to and sealed all the doors, except the main entrance, with tape and wax. For if the doors were really opened, I was going to be sure of the fact. I was going to run no risk of being deceived by ghostly hallucination or mesmeric influence. By the time that this was done, the policemen had unloaded the donkeys and were waiting, looking about them curiously. I set 2 of them to lay a fire in the big grate, and the others I used as I required them. I took one of the boarhounds to the end of the hall furthest from the entrance, and there I drove a staple into the floor to which I tied the dog with a short tether. Then round him I drew upon the floor the figure of a pentacle in chalk. Outside of the pentacle I made a circle with garlic. I did exactly the same thing with the other hound, but over more in the northeast corner of the big hall, where the 2 rows of doors make the angle. When this was done, I cleared the whole center of the hall and put one of the policemen to sweep it, after which I had all my apparatus carried into the cleared space. Then I went over to the main door and hooked it open, so that the hook would have to be lifted out of the hasp before the door could be closed. After that, I placed lighted candles before each of the sealed doors, and one in each corner of the big room, and then I lit the fire. When I saw that it was properly alight, I got all of the men together by the pile of things in the center of the room and took their pipes from them, for as the Sigsand manuscript has it, there must no light come from within the barrier, and I was going to make sure. I got my tape measure then, and measured out a circle 30 feet in diameter, and immediately chalked it out. The police in Wentworth were tremendously interested, and I took the opportunity to warn them that this was no piece of silly mumming on my part, but done with definite intention of erecting a barrier between us and any abhuman thing that the night might show us. I warned them that as they valued their lives, and more than their lives it might be, no one must on any account whatsoever pass beyond the limits of the barrier that I was making. After I had drawn the circle, I took a bunch of the garlic and smudged it right round the chalk circle, a little outside of it. When this was complete, I called for candles from my stock of material. I set the police to lighting them. and as they were lit, I took them and sealed them down to the floor just within the chalk circle 5 inches apart. As each candle measured approximately 1 inch in diameter, it took 66 candles to complete the circle, and I need hardly say that every number and measurement has a significance. Then from candle to candle I took a gayrd of human hair, entwining it alternately to the left and to the right until the circle was completed, and by the ends of the hair shod with silver and pressed into the wax of the 66th candle. It had now been dark some time, and I made haste to get the defense complete. To this end I got the men well together and began to fit the electric pentacle right around us, so that the 5 points of the defensive star came just within the hair circle. This did not take me long, and a minute later I had connected up the batteries, and the weak blue glare of the intertwining vacuum tubes shone all around us. I felt happier then, for this pentacle is, as you all know, a wonderful defense. I have told you before how the idea came to me after reading Professor Gardner's experiments with a medium. He found that a current of a certain number of vibrations in vacuo insulated the medium. It is difficult to suggest an explanation non-technically, and if you are really interested, you should read Carter's lecture on astral vibrations compared with Matero involuted vibrations below the 6 billion limit. As I stood up from my work, I could hear outside in the night a constant drip from the laurels, which, as I have said, come right up around the house very thick. By the sound, I knew that a soft rain had set in, and there was absolutely no wind, as I could tell by the steady flame of the candles. I stood a moment or two listening, and then one of the men touched my arm and asked me in a low voice what they should do. By his tone, I could tell that he was feeling something of the strangeness of it all, and the other men, including Wentworth, were so quiet that I was afraid they were beginning to get shaky. I set to then, and arranged them with their backs to one common center, so that they were sitting flat upon the floor with their feet radiating outward. Then by compass, I laid their legs to the 8 chief points, and afterward I drew a circle with chalk around them, and opposite to their feet I made the 8 signs of the Sama ritual. The 8th place was, of course, empty, but ready for me to occupy at any moment, for I had omitted to make the sealing sign to that point until I had finished all my preparations and could enter the inner star. I took a last look round the great hall and saw that the 2 big hounds were lying quietly, with their noses between their paws. The fire was big and cheerful, and the candles before the 2 rows of doors burnt steadily, as well as the solitary ones in the corners. Then I went round the little star of men and warned them not to be frightened whatever happened, but to trust the defense, and to let nothing tempt or drive them to cross the barriers. Also, I told them to watch their movements, and to keep their feet strictly to their places. For the rest, there was to be no shooting unless I gave the word. And now at last I went to my place, and sitting down made the 8th sign just beyond my feet. Then I arranged my camera and flashlight handy and examined my revolver. Wentworth sat behind the first sign, and as the numbering went round reversed, that put him next to me on my left. I asked him in a low voice how he felt, and he told me rather nervous, but that he felt confidence in my knowledge, and was resolved to go through with the matter whatever happened. We settled down to wait. There was no talking, except that once or twice the police bent toward one another, and whispered odd remarks concerning the hall, that appeared queerly audible in the intense silence. But in a while there was not even a whisper from anyone, and only the monotonous drip-drip of the quiet rain without the great entrance, and the low, dull sound of the fire in the big fireplace. It was a queer group that we made sitting there, back to back, with our legs starred outward, and all around us the strange blue glow of the pentacle, and beyond that the brilliant shining of the great ring of lighted candles. Outside of the glare of the candles, the large empty hall looked a little gloomy by contrast, except where the lights shone before the sealed doors, and the blaze of the big fire made a good honest mass of flame. And the feeling of mystery, can you picture it all? It might have been an hour later that it came to me suddenly that I was aware of an extraordinary sense of dreeness, as it were, come into the air of the place. Not the nervous feeling of mystery that had been with us all the time, but a new feeling, as if there was something going to happen any moment. Abruptly there came a slight noise from the east end of the hall, and I felt the star of men move suddenly. "Steady, keep steady," I shouted, and they quietened. I looked up the hall and saw that the dogs were upon their feet, and staring in an extraordinary fashion toward the great entrance. I turned and stared also, and felt the men move as they craned their heads to look. Suddenly the dogs set up a tremendous barking, and I glanced across to them. and found they were still pointing for the big doorway. They ceased their noise just as quickly and seemed to be listening. In the same instant, I heard a faint chink of metal to my left. That set me staring at the hook which held the great door wide. It moved even as I looked. Some invisible thing was meddling with it. A queer, sickening thrill went through me, and I felt all the men about me stiffen and go rigid with intensity. I had a certainty of something impending, as it might be the impression of an invisible but overwhelming presence. The hall was full of a queer silence, and not a sound came from the dogs. Then I saw the hook slowly raised from out of its hasp, without any visible thing touching it. Then a sudden power of movement came to me. I raised my camera with the flashlight fixed, and snapped it at the door. There came the great blare of the flashlight, and a simultaneous roar of barking from the two dogs. The intensity of the flash made all the place seem dark for some moments, and in that time of darkness, I heard a jingle in the direction of the door, and strained to look. The effect of the bright light passed, and I could see clearly again. The great entrance door was being slowly closed. It shut with a sharp snick, and there followed a long silence, broken only by the whimpering of the dogs. I turned suddenly and looked at Wentworth. He was looking at me. "Just as it did before," he whispered. "Most extraordinary," I said, and he nodded and looked round nervously. The policemen were pretty quiet, and I judged that they were feeling rather worse than Wentworth, though for that matter, you must not think that I was altogether natural. Yet I have seen so much that is extraordinary that I dare say I can keep my nerves steady longer than most people. I looked over my shoulder at the men and cautioned them in a low voice not to move outside of the barriers, whatever happened, not even though the house should seem to be rocking and about to tumble onto them, for well I knew what some of the great forces are capable of doing. Yet unless it should prove to be one of the cases of the more terrible Psitte manifestation, we were almost certain of safety, so long as we kept to our order within the pentacle. Perhaps an hour and a half passed, quietly, except when once in a way the dogs would whine distressfully. Presently, however, they ceased even from this, and I could see them lying on the floor with their paws over their noses, in a most peculiar fashion, and shivering visibly. The sight made me feel more serious, as you can understand. Suddenly, the candle in the corner furthest from the main door went out. An instant later, Wentworth jerked my arm, and I saw that the candle before one of the sealed doors had been put out. I held my camera ready. Then, one after another, every candle about the hall was put out, and with such speed and irregularity that I could never catch one in the actual act of being extinguished. Yet for all that, I took a flashlight of the hall in general. There was a time in which I sat half blinded by the great glare of the flash, and I blamed myself for not having remembered to bring a pair of smoked goggles, which I have sometimes used at these times. I had felt the men jump at the sudden light, and I called out loud to them to sit quiet and to keep their feet exactly to their proper places. My voice, as you can imagine, sounded rather horrid and frightening in the great room, and altogether it was a beastly moment. Then I was able to see again, and I stared here and there about the hall, but there was nothing showing unusual. Only, of course, it was dark now over in the corners. Suddenly I saw that the great fire was blackening. It was going out visibly as I looked. If I said that some monstrous, invisible, impossible creature sucked the life from it, I could best explain the way the light and flame went out of it. It was most extraordinary to watch. In the time that I watched it, every vestige of fire was gone from it, and there was no light outside of the ring of candles around the pentacle. The deliberateness of the thing troubled me more than I can make clear to you. It conveyed to me such a sense of calm, deliberate force present in the hall. The steadfast intention to make a darkness was horrible. The extent of the power to affect the material was horrible. The extent of the power to affect the material was now the one constant, anxious questioning in my brain. You can understand. Behind me I heard the policemen moving again, and I knew that they were getting thoroughly frightened. I turned half round and told them quietly but plainly that they were safe only so long as they stayed within the pentacle, in the position in which I had put them. If they once broke and went outside of the barrier, no knowledge of mine could state the full extent of the dreadfulness of the danger. I steadied them up by this quiet, straight reminder, but if they had known, as I knew, that there is no certainty in any protection, they would have suffered a great deal more, and probably have broken the defense, and made a mad, foolish run for an impossible safety. Another hour passed after this, in absolute quietness. I had a sense of awful strain and oppression, as though I were a little spirit in the company of some invisible, brooding monster of the unseen world, who, as yet, was scarcely conscious of us. I leant across to Wentworth and asked him in a whisper whether he had a feeling, as if something were in the room. He looked very pale, and his eyes kept always on the move. He glanced just once at me and nodded, then stared away round the hall again, and when I came to think, I was doing the same thing. Abruptly, as though 100 unseen hands had snuffed them, every candle in the barrier went dead out, and we were left in a darkness that seemed for a little absolute, for the light of the pentacle was too weak and pale to penetrate far across the great hall. I tell you, for a moment, I just sat there as though I had been frozen solid. I felt the creep go all over me, and seemed to stop in my brain. I felt all at once to be given a power of hearing that was far beyond the normal. I could hear my own heart thudding most extraordinarily loud. I began, however, to feel better after a while, but I simply had not the pluck to move. You can understand. Presently, I began to get my courage back. I gripped at my camera and flashlight and waited. My hands were simply soaked with sweat. I glanced once at Wentworth. I could see him only dimly. His shoulders were hunched a little, his head forward, but though it was motionless, I knew that his eyes were not. It is queer how one knows that sort of thing at times. The police were just as silent, and thus a while passed. A sudden sound broke across the silence. From two sides of the room there came faint noises. I recognized them at once as the breaking of the sealing wax. The sealed doors were opening. I raised the camera and flashlight, and it was a peculiar mixture of fear and courage that helped me to press the button. As the great flare of light lit up the hall, I felt the men all about me jump. The darkness fell like a clap of thunder, if you can understand, and seemed tenfold. Yet in the moment of brightness, I had seen that all the sealed doors were wide open. Suddenly, all around us there sounded a drip, drip, drip upon the floor of the great hall. I thrilled with a queer, realizing emotion, and a sense of a very real and present danger imminent. The blood drip had commenced, and the grim question was now whether the barriers could save us from whatever had come into the huge room. Through some awful minutes the blood drip continued to fall in an increasing rain, and presently some began to fall within the barriers. I saw several great drops splash and star upon the pale glowing intertwining tubes of the electric pentacle, but strangely enough, I could not trace that any fell among us. Beyond the strange, horrible noise of the drip, there was no other sound. And then abruptly from the boarhound over in the far corner, there came a terrible yelling howl of agony, followed instantly by a sickening, breaking noise and an immediate silence. If you have ever, when out shooting, broken a rabbit's neck, you will know the sound, in miniature. Like lightning the thought sprang into my brain. It has crossed the pentacle, for you will remember that I had made one about each of the dogs. I thought instantly, with a sick apprehension, of our own barriers. There was something in the hall with us that had passed the barrier of the pentacle about one of the dogs. In the awful succeeding silence I positively quivered, and suddenly one of the men behind me gave out a scream, like any woman, and bolted for the door. He fumbled and had it open in a moment. I yelled to the others not to move, but they followed like sheep, and I heard them kick the candles flying in their panic. One of them stepped on the electric pentacle and smashed it, and there was an utter darkness. In an instant I realized that I was defenseless against the powers of the unknown world, and with one savage leap I was out of the useless barriers and instantly through the great doorway and into the night. I believe I yelled with sheer funk. The men were a little ahead of me, and I never ceased running, and neither did they. Sometimes I glanced back over my shoulder, and I kept glancing into the laurels which grew all along the drive. The beastly things kept rustling in a hollow sort of way, as though something were keeping parallel with me among them. The rain had stopped, and a dismal little wind kept moaning through the grounds. It was disgusting. I caught Wentworth and the police at the lodge gate. We got outside and ran all the way to the village. We found old Dennis up waiting for us, and half the villagers to keep him company. He told us that he had known in his soul that we should come back, that is, if we came back at all, which is not a bad rendering of his remark. Fortunately, I had brought my camera away from the house, possibly because the strap had happened to be over my head. Yet I did not go straight away to develop, but sat with the rest of the bar where we talked for some hours, trying to be coherent about the whole horrible business. Later, however, I went up to my room and proceeded with my photography. I was steadier now, and it was just possible, so I hoped, that the negatives might show something. On two of the plates I found nothing unusual, But on the third, which was the first one that I snapped, I saw something that made me quite excited. I examined it very carefully with a magnifying glass, then I put it to wash and slipped a pair of rubber overshoes over my boots. The negative had showed me something very extraordinary, and I had made up my mind to test the truth of what it seemed to indicate, without losing another moment. It was no use telling anything to Wentworth and the police until I was certain, and also I believed that I stood a greater chance to succeed by myself, though for that matter, I do not suppose anything would have taken them up to the manor again that night. I took my revolver and went quietly downstairs and into the dark. The rain had commenced again, but that did not bother me. I walked hard. When I came to the lodge gates, a sudden queer instinct stopped me from going through, and I climbed the wall into the park. I kept away from the drive and approached the building through the dismal, dripping laurels. You can imagine how beastly it was. Every time a leaf rustled, I jumped. I made my way round to the back of the big house and got in through a little window which I had taken note of during my search, for of course I knew the whole place from roof to cellars. I went silently up the kitchen stairs, fairly quivering with funk, and at the top I went to the left, and then into a long corridor that opened through one of the doorways we had sealed into the big hall. I looked up it and saw a faint flicker of light away at the end, and I tiptoed silently toward it, holding my revolver ready. As I came near to the open door, I heard men's voices, and then a burst of laughing. I went on until I could see into the hall. There were several men there, all in a group. They were well dressed, and one, at least, I saw was armed. They were examining my barriers against the supernatural, with a good deal of unkind laughter. I never felt such a fool in my life. It was plain to me that they were a gang of men who had made use of the empty manor, perhaps for years, for some purpose of their own. And now that Wentworth was attempting to take possession, they were acting up the traditions of the place, with the view of driving him away, and keeping so useful a place still at their disposal. But what they were, I mean whether coiners, thieves, inventors, or what, I could not imagine. Presently they left the pentacle and gathered round the living boarhound, which seemed curiously quiet, as though it were half drugged. There was some talk as to whether to let the poor brute live or not, but finally they decided it would be good policy to kill it. I saw two of them force a twisted loop of rope into its mouth, and the two bites of the loop were brought together at the back of the hound's neck. Then a third man thrust a thick walking stick through the two loops. The two men with the rope stooped to hold the dog, so that I could not see what was done. But the poor beast gave a sudden awful howl, and immediately there was a repetition of the uncomfortable breaking sound I had heard earlier in the night, as you will remember. The men stood up and left the dog lying there, quiet enough now, as you may suppose. For my part, I fully appreciated the calculated remorselessness which had decided upon the animal's death, and the cold determination with which it had been afterward executed so neatly. I guessed that a man who might get into the light of those particular men would be likely to come to quite as an uncomfortable an ending. A minute later, one of the men called out to the rest that they should shift their wires. One of the men came toward the doorway of the corridor in which I stood, and I ran quickly back into the darkness of the upper end. I saw the man reach up and take something from the top of the door, and I heard the slight, ringing jangle of steel wire. When he had gone, I ran back again and saw the men passing, one after another, through an opening in the stairs formed by one of the marble steps being raised. When the last man had vanished, the slab that made the step was shut down, and there was not a sign of the secret door. It was the seventh step from the bottom, as I took care to count, and a splendid idea, for it was so solid that it did not ring hollow, even to a faintly heavy hammer, as I found later. There is a little more to tell. I got out of the house as quickly and quietly as possible and back to the inn. The police came without any coaxing when they knew the ghosts were normal flesh and blood. We entered the park and the manor in the same way that I had done, yet when we tried to open the step we failed and had to finally smash it. This must have warned the haunters, for when we descended to a secret room, which we found at the end of a long and narrow passage in the thickness of the walls, we found no one. The police were horribly disgusted, as you can imagine, but for my part I did not care either way. I had laid the ghost, as you might say, and that was what I set out to do. I was not particularly afraid of being laughed at by the others, for they had all been thoroughly taken in, and in the end I had scored without their help. We searched right through the secret ways and found that there was an exit at the end of a long tunnel, which opened in the side of a well out in the grounds. The ceiling of the wall was hollow and reached by a little secret stairway inside of the big staircase. The blood drip was merely colored water, dropped through the minute crevices of the ornamented ceiling. How the candles in the fire were put out, I do not know. For the haunters certainly did not act quite up to tradition, which held that the lights were put out by the blood drip. Perhaps it was too difficult to direct the fluid without positively squirting it, which might have given the whole thing away. The candles in the fire may possibly have been extinguished by the agency of carbonic acid gas, but how suspended, I have no idea. The secret hiding places were, of course, ancient. There was also, did I tell you, a bell which they had rigged up to ring when anyone entered the gates at the end of the drive. If I had not climbed the wall, I should have found nothing for my pains, for the bell would have warned them had I gone in through the gateway. What was on the negative? I asked with much curiosity. A picture of the fine wire with which they were grappling for the hook that held the entrance door open. They were doing it from one of the crevices in the ceiling. They had evidently made no preparations for lifting the hook. I suppose that they never thought anyone would make use of it, and so they had to improvise a grapple. The wire was too fine to be seen by the amount of light we had in the hall, but the flashlight picked it out, do you see? The opening of the inner doors was managed by wires, as you will have guessed, which they unshipped after use. Or else I should have found them when I made my search. I think I have now explained everything. The hound was killed, of course, by the men direct. You see, they made the place as dark as possible first. Of course, if I had managed to take a flashlight just at that instant, the whole secret of the haunting would have been exposed. But fate just ordered it the other way. And the tramps? I asked. Oh, you mean the 2 tramps who were found dead in the manor, said Carnacki. Well, of course it is impossible to be sure one way or the other. Perhaps they happened to find out something and were given a hypodermic. Or it is just as probable that they had come to the time of their dying and just died naturally. It is conceivable that a great many tramps had slept in the old house at one time or another. Carnacki stood up, knocked out his pipe. We rose also and went for our coats and hats. Out you go, said Carnacki genially, using the recognized formula, and we went out onto the embankment, and presently through the darkness to our various homes.